The room had grown cold, not the sharp cold of winter wind, but something slower, something that crept beneath the skin and settled in the marrow. The curtains were drawn, the gas lamps had been extinguished. Only candles remained, their flames stretching tall and thin in the stillness, casting shadows that moved with a rhythm all their own. 7 figures sat around the mahogany table, their hands linked in a chain of damp palms and trembling fingers. The medium sat at the head, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and deliberate. She wore black silk that whispered when she moved, and her hair was pinned high beneath a veil that seemed too thin for mourning, too dark for anything else. Outside, beyond the velvet and the wood, London held its breath. It was the 31st of October, 1872, and the street smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. But here, in this parlour on Belgrave Square, time had stopped. The medium's lips parted. Her voice, when it came, was not her own. It was deeper, older. It came from a place beneath the floorboards, beneath the earth, beneath the century itself. "They are here," she whispered, and the table began to move. Chapter 1, The Veil Between Worlds. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small and still around you. Wherever you are listening, whether beneath warm blankets in a room lit only by the glow of a screen, or in the last hours before dawn breaks, you are safe here. The past cannot harm you, it can only whisper. And tonight, as we approach the threshold of All Hallows Eve, we slip backward through time, into an era when the living spoke to the dead, when parlours filled with candle smoke and trembling hands, when grief wore black silk and hope wore a veil. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I invite you to do so now. Let us be companions in the dark, you and I, as we explore the shadows that history has left behind. And now, let the story begin. The year was 1848, and the world was changing faster than memory could hold it. Steam engines roared across iron rails. Telegraph wires hummed with invisible words. Factories rose like cathedrals to a new god, belching smoke into skies that had once belonged to birds and clouds and the slow turning of seasons. In England, in America, in the great cities of Europe, the old certainties were crumbling. The earth itself seemed to shake beneath the weight of progress. And in the midst of all this noise, all this speed, all this relentless forward motion, something quieter began to stir, something that looked backward, something that reached not toward the future, but toward the grave. It began with a sound, a knocking, a rapping, a series of sharp, inexplicable noises in the walls of a modest wooden farmhouse in Hydesville, New York. The Fox family, simple people, Methodist people, people who read their Bible and said their prayers, heard the sounds and could not explain them. The knocking came at night. It came in patterns. It seemed impossibly to respond to questions. Margaret Fox, 14 years old, with dark eyes and a serious mouth, asked the presents to repeat her claps. It did. Her younger sister Kate, 12 and slight as a shadow, asked it to count. It obliged. Their mother, trembling in her nightgown, asked if it was a spirit. The knocking answered yes. Within weeks the news had spread. Within months the phenomenon had consumed the eastern seaboard of America like a fever. The Fox sisters were taken from their farmhouse and brought to parlours, to meeting halls, to the homes of the curious and the desperate. They sat in darkened rooms while audiences pressed close, listening for the raps that came from nowhere, that spoke in a code of knocks and silences. The spirits, it was said, had found a way through, the dead were speaking, and the living, so many of the living, were eager to listen. This was not the first time humanity had sought communion with the departed. The ancients had consulted oracles and necromancers. Medieval Christians had prayed to saints and witnessed visions of the afterlife. But this was different. This was modern. This was democratic. The spirits did not require priests or temples or years of study. They required only a medium, a sensitive soul, usually a woman, usually young, and a willingness to believe. In an age of scientific discovery, when electricity and magnetism were revealing invisible forces in the natural world, why should there not be invisible forces in the spiritual world as well? If sound could travel through wires, could not souls travel through the veil between life and death? The movement that emerged from those first mysterious wrappings came to be called Spiritualism, and it spread with astonishing speed. By the early 1850s, mediums were operating in every major city in America and Britain. Séances were held in private homes and public halls. Newspapers debated the authenticity of spirit communication. Scientists and scholars attended demonstrations, some to debunk, others to investigate with genuine curiosity. The movement attracted reformers and radicals, women's rights advocates and abolitionists, poets and philosophers. It also attracted the grieving. And in the middle decades of the 19th century, grief was everywhere. Death was a constant companion in Victorian life. Infant mortality claimed one child in every 3 before the age of 5. Tuberculosis wasted the young and healthy. Cholera swept through crowded cities with terrible efficiency. Childbirth killed mothers. Accidents killed workers. War killed soldiers. And there was no consolation adequate to the scale of loss. The church offered heaven, but heaven was distant and abstract, a place of hymns and golden streets that felt nothing like the person who had died. The séance offered something more immediate. It offered a conversation. It offered proof. It offered the voice of the beloved, speaking through the lips of a stranger in a darkened room, saying the things the living most needed to hear. I am well. I am happy. I am not lost. I am only waiting. For those who had lost children, the appeal was almost unbearable in its intensity. Mothers who had buried infants, who had closed the eyes of toddlers taken by scarlet fever, who had watched their sons waste away from consumption, came to the séance table with a hunger that transcended skepticism. They came prepared to believe, because the alternative that their children were simply gone, that consciousness ended with the body, that there would be no reunion, was unthinkable. The medium who could produce a child's voice, who could describe a locket or a toy or a pet name known only to the family, could command absolute devotion. She became not merely a performer but a lifeline, a bridge across the abyss. And so the séance became a ritual, formalized and repeated, with its own rules and expectations. The room had to be dark, or nearly so, because the spirits were said to be weakened by light. Candles were permitted, but gas lamps were extinguished. The participants sat in a circle, their hands linked, forming an unbroken chain of human contact. This was called the circle, and it was believed to generate a kind of spiritual energy, a force that the medium could channel and the spirits could use. The medium sat at the head of the table, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes bound to her chair with rope to prove she was not using trickery. An opening prayer was often spoken. Hymns were sometimes sung, and then came the waiting. The waiting was essential. It built tension. It allowed the mind to adjust to the darkness, to the silence, to the heightened state of attention that made the appalling sound seem significant. Breathing slowed. Heartbeats became audible. The creaking of floorboards, the rustle of fabric, the distant sounds of the street outside, all took on a weight they did not ordinarily possess. And then, if the spirits were willing, the phenomena would begin. Sometimes it was the rapping, sharp knocks on the table, on the walls, on the floor beneath their feet. The medium would ask questions, and the spirits would answer in a simple code. 1 knock for yes, 2 for no, 3 knocks for certainty or the presence of multiple spirits. More complex messages could be spelled out letter by letter, with the medium reciting the alphabet and the spirits knocking at the appropriate letter. It was slow, painstaking work, but for those who believed, every laboriously spelled word was a revelation. Sometimes the table itself would move. It would tilt on 2 legs, rocking back and forth with a rhythm that seemed independent of the sitters. It would spin, would rise into the air, lifting clear off the ground while hands remained pressed to its surface. Skeptics would later attribute this to unconscious muscular pressure, to the ideomotor effect, to simple fraud. But in the moment, in the darkness, with the table vibrating beneath their palms and the medium's breathing growing ragged, believers felt they were in the presence of something genuinely otherworldly. Sometimes the medium would speak in voices not her own. Her face would go slack, her eyes would roll back, and from her mouth would come the words of the departed. A child's voice, high and sweet. An old man's rasp, a foreign accent. The voice would address the sitters by name, would reference private matters, would offer comfort or warnings or cryptic messages that seemed to carry meaning beyond their surface. This was called trance mediumship, and it required a particular kind of performer, someone who could surrender control or appear to, someone who could become a vessel for something other than herself. And sometimes, in the most dramatic séances, there were physical manifestations, ectoplasm, a strange pale substance, said to be the materialization of spiritual energy, would emerge from the medium's mouth or nose or other orifices, glowing faintly in the darkness, taking vague shapes that believers interpreted as the forms of spirits. Spirit hands would appear, pale and luminous, touching the faces of sitters or playing musical instruments that had been placed in the center of the circle. Objects would fly through the air, cold breezes would sweep through sealed rooms, and occasionally, very occasionally, a full-body apparition would manifest. A figure in white, translucent and shimmering, standing at the edge of the candlelight before fading back into shadow. The Victorians, for all their industrial confidence, for all their steam and progress and imperial certainty, lived in profound existential anxiety. The discoveries of geology and biology were undermining the literal truth of Genesis. The fossil record suggested an Earth far older than the biblical 6,000 years. Darwin's theory of evolution, published in 1859, proposed a natural history of life that required no divine intervention. The universe, as revealed by science, was becoming colder, more mechanical, less concerned with human meaning, and so spiritualism offered a counter-narrative. It said that science and spirit were not enemies but allies. It said that the afterlife could be investigated, demonstrated, proven through evidence and experimentation. It married the language of faith with the methodology of inquiry, and in doing so it gave comfort to those who could no longer find it in the pulpit alone. By the time 1872 arrived, spiritualism had been thriving for nearly a quarter century. It had survived exposés and scandals. It had weathered the skepticism of scientists and the condemnation of clergymen. It had adapted, evolved, spread. The séance had become a familiar feature of Victorian social life, as common in its way as the dinner party or the musicale. And nowhere was it more popular, more expected, more eagerly anticipated than on the night of October 31st, when the veil between worlds was said to grow thin, and the dead walked closest to the living. Chapter 2. The Darkened Parlor. The preparation of a séance chamber was not a casual matter. It required deliberation, attention to detail, and an understanding of atmosphere that bordered on theatrical. The room chosen was typically a parlor or withdrawing room in a private home, a space already associated with gentility and intimacy, where family and trusted friends gathered away from the public eye. But on the night of a séance, such a room was transformed. It became a threshold space, neither entirely of the living world nor entirely of the dead, but suspended between them, waiting. The transformation began in the afternoon, sometimes earlier. Furniture was rearranged. The heavy mahogany or walnut table around which the sitters would gather was moved to the center of the room, positioned so that no one would sit with their back to a door or window. This was considered important. The sitters needed to feel enclosed, protected, contained within the circle. Chairs were placed at even intervals, enough for the medium and her guests, but not so many that the circle felt diluted. Intimacy was essential. A séance with 20 participants was a spectacle. A séance with 6 or 7 was a communion. The curtains were drawn, heavy velvet or damask that shut out not only the light but the sounds of the street. The world beyond the window had to be made distant, irrelevant. If the séance was to be held in the evening, as most were, the gas lamps were checked and adjusted so they could be easily extinguished. Candles were placed strategically, usually on the mantelpiece, on side tables, away from the séance table itself. They would provide just enough light to see faces, to navigate the room, but not enough to dispel the shadows that would gather in the corners and press against the ceiling. The medium often brought her own objects. A cabinet, if she practiced cabinet mediumship, in which she would sit concealed while spirits allegedly materialized outside it. A trumpet, a cone-shaped brass or tin instrument that spirits were said to use to amplify their voices, which would sometimes float through the air, glowing faintly with phosphorescent paint. A tambourine or small bell, which would ring or rattle when touched by invisible hands. A slate and chalk for spirit writing, where messages would appear between two slates bound together, written by no mortal hand. These objects were arranged within reach, but not within easy grasp of the sitters, so that when they moved or sounded, the effect would seem genuinely uncanny. The medium herself prepared with equal care. She dressed for the occasion, almost always in black or deep purple, colours of mourning and mystery. The fabrics were soft, silk, satin, velvet, materials that whispered when she moved, that caught and reflected the candlelight. Her clothing was often loose, flowing, designed to suggest vulnerability and transparency. She was meant to appear as a vessel, not a performer. Her hair was arranged simply, sometimes covered with a veil or shawl. Jewelry was minimal. The goal was to efface the personality, to make herself a neutral channel through which other voices could speak. Some mediums fasted before a séance, claiming that an empty stomach made them more receptive to spiritual influence. Others abstained from alcohol or strong tea, anything that might cloud the senses. A few insisted on spending the hour before the séance in prayer or meditation, sitting alone in a darkened room, preparing themselves mentally and spiritually for the ordeal ahead. For it was an ordeal, or at least it was presented as such. The medium would emerge from her preparation looking pale, fragile, already half entranced. She would speak in a soft voice, asking the sitters to please be patient, to please maintain the circle no matter what occurred, to please remember that the spirits were delicate and easily frightened away. The sitters arrived at the appointed hour, usually after dinner, when the household had settled and the servants had been dismissed or instructed to remain below stairs. They came dressed in their best, as if for church or a formal occasion, because the séance was both. They brought with them their grief, their questions, their desperate hope. Some brought objects that had belonged to the deceased, a locket, a handkerchief, a photograph, a lock of hair, items that the medium might touch or hold, claiming they helped her establish a connection with the spirit in question. They were greeted quietly, shown into the parlour, invited to take their seats. Conversation was hushed. The mood was already solemn, reverent. The medium would welcome each sitter by name, would clasp their hands, would look into their eyes with an expression of deep sympathy. She was establishing trust, rapport, the psychological groundwork upon which the séance would be built. She would ask if anyone was experiencing doubt or negativity, because such emotions, she explained, could disrupt the spiritual energy and drive the spirits away. It was a clever preemptive defense. Any failure of the séance could be blamed on the skepticism of the sitters rather than the skill of the medium. When all were seated, the medium would take her place at the head of the table. She would ask everyone to join hands, forming the unbroken circle. The touch of hand to hand, palm to palm, was intimate and uncomfortable in equal measure. Victorian propriety did not ordinarily permit such casual physical contact, especially between men and women who were not married or related. But the séance required it, and the breach of social convention added to the sense of transgression, of crossing boundaries. The medium would then offer an opening invocation. The language varied depending on her tradition and her audience, but the structure was consistent. She would call upon the spirits, invite them to draw near, assure them that they were welcome and awaited. She would ask for protection from any malevolent entities, requesting that only spirits of light and love be permitted to enter the circle. She would remind the sitters to remain calm, to keep their hands linked, to to resist the urge to break the circle no matter what they witnessed. And then she would ask someone, often the most skeptical or most rational member of the group, to extinguish the gas lamps. The darkness, when it came, was almost total. The candles provided only dim pools of light, islands in a sea of shadow. The faces of the sitters became indistinct, reduced to pale ovals and glints of reflected light in eyes. The room seemed to contract and expand simultaneously, the walls pressing close and receding into infinite distance. Breathing became louder. The rustle of fabric, the creak of a chair, the settling of the house itself, all were magnified. The mind, deprived of visual information, began to supply its own. Shapes moved in the periphery of vision. The darkness was not empty but full, crowded with suggestion. The waiting began. Minutes passed, 5, 10, sometimes 15 or more. The medium sat with her eyes closed, her head tilted back or bowed forward, her breathing slow and deliberate. She was entering trance, or appearing to. The sitters watched her, or tried to, in the dimness. Some grew restless, some felt foolish. Others felt anticipation building in their chests, tightening their throats. And then, just when the tension had reached its peak, just when someone might have been tempted to speak or laugh or break the circle, the phenomena would begin. A knock, sharp and clear, from somewhere beneath the table. Everyone heard it. Eyes widened, hands gripped tighter. The medium's lips moved, though no sound emerged at first. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she would ask, "Is someone there?" Another knock, louder this time. "Are you a spirit?" One knock. "Yes." "Will you communicate with us?" One knock. "Yes." And the séance had begun. The darkness was no longer empty. Something was in the room with them, something that answered questions, that moved objects, that spoke through the medium's lips. Whether it was truly the dead or merely the power of suggestion and theatrical skill mattered less, in that moment, than the fact that it felt real. The grief, the longing, the need to believe, all of it converged in that darkened parlour, transforming a Victorian drawing room into a gateway to the other side. The table was the centre of it all. The table was where hands met, where knocks sounded, where objects were placed for the spirits to manipulate. It was solid English oak or walnut, heavy and respectable, the kind of furniture that anchored a household. But in the séance it became unstable. It rocked, it tilted. It moved in ways that furniture should not move. Sitters would feel it vibrating beneath their palms, a tremor that started faint and grew stronger, as if some tremendous energy were building within the wood itself. The medium would call out, asking the spirits to make their presence known through the table. "If you are here, please move the table, let us feel your power." And the table would respond. It would tilt up on two legs, leaning toward one side of the circle, then settling back with a thud. It would spin slowly, the sitters walking their chairs around to maintain contact with it. In the most dramatic instances, it would levitate entirely, rising a foot or more off the floor, hovering impossibly before crashing back down. Skeptics would later demonstrate how such effects could be achieved through collective unconscious muscular action, through leverage and coordination disguised as supernatural force. But in the darkness, with the medium in apparent trance and the sitters convinced of their own passivity, the movement of the table seemed undeniably paranormal. And for those who desperately wanted to believe, who had come seeking proof of survival beyond death, the tilting table was proof enough. Other phenomena would follow, escalating in drama as the séance progressed. The trumpet, that brass cone sitting in the centre of the table, would begin to glow with its phosphorescent coating, and then it would rise. It would float upward, drifting through the air as if carried by invisible hands, and from its bell would come voices, whispers, distant words, fragments of sentences. The medium's spirit guide would often speak through the trumpet, introducing other spirits, facilitating communication. The voices were never quite clear, always muffled or distorted, but they were distinct enough to be attributed to specific individuals by hopeful listeners. The tambourine would shake and rattle, chiming out rhythms that seemed too complex to be accidental. The bell would ring from different corners of the room, as if an unseen presence were moving from place to place, and if the sitters were fortunate, if the conditions were right, if the medium was at the height of her powers, something more extraordinary might occur. Spirit hands, pale, luminous, emerging from the darkness like flowers blooming in the void. They would reach out and touch the faces of sitters, cold and slightly damp with the texture of flesh but without warmth. They would pat heads, stroke hair, grasp fingers. Sometimes there was only one hand. Sometimes there were several, moving independently, touching multiple sitters simultaneously. The experience was profoundly unsettling, even for believers. To be touched by something you could not see, could not identify, could not explain, was to confront the limits of understanding itself. And then there was ectoplasm, the strangest phenomenon of all. It appeared first as a faint glow emanating from the medium, usually from her mouth or nose. Then it would extrude a pale, gauzy substance that seemed part solid, part vapour, luminous in the darkness. It would take vague shapes, sometimes resembling a human face, sometimes merely an abstract form, and then it would recede, flowing back into the medium's body as if drawn by invisible tides. Photographs would later be taken of ectoplasm, showing mediums with great masses of the substance draped across their laps or emerging from their faces. To modern eyes, the material looks unmistakably like cheesecloth, muslin, or even regurgitated fabric, but to Victorian observers, especially in the dim light of the séance room, it appeared genuinely supernatural. The séance would continue for an hour, sometimes two. The medium would grow visibly exhausted, her face slick with perspiration, her breathing laboured. She would deliver messages from the dead, speaking in voices that were not her own, addressing sitters by name, revealing secrets that only the departed could know, or so it seemed. She would answer questions posed to the spirits, though the answers were often cryptic or ambiguous, open to interpretation. And she would offer comfort. All was comfort. The dead were happy. They were at peace. They watched over the living. They would be reunited in time. When the séance finally ended, the medium would emerge from her trance slowly, as if waking from deep sleep. She would often claim to remember nothing of what had occurred, a convenient amnesia that absolved her of responsibility for anything said or done while under spirit control. The gas lamps would be relit. The ordinary world would reassert itself. The sitters would blink in the sudden brightness, dazed and exhausted themselves, struggling to reconcile what they had experienced with what they knew to be possible. They would leave quietly, speaking in hushed voices, clutching the messages they had received like sacred texts, and the medium would retire to her private quarters to rest and recover, to count the payment she had received, and to prepare for the next séance, the next group of believers, the next performance in the theatre of the dead. Chapter 3. The Fox Sisters and the Wrappings. The house in Hydesville was not remarkable. It was a modest 2-story wooden structure, painted white with shutters that needed repair and a chimney that drew poorly. It stood on a rutted road in the western reaches of New York State, in a region of small farms and Methodist congregations, where people rose early and worked hard and believed in the simple truths of Scripture. The Fox family had moved into the house in December of 1847, renting it from a farmer who had found it difficult to keep tenants. There were stories about the house, vague rumours that previous occupants had been disturbed by strange sounds, but the Foxes were practical people and did not put much stock in ghost tales. John Fox was a blacksmith, a man of broad shoulders and calloused hands who spoke little and expected his household to be orderly. His wife, Margaret, was a devout woman who read her Bible daily and kept a clean home. They had 6 children, though only the 2 youngest daughters, Margaret, called Maggie, and Catherine, called Kate, were still living at home. Maggie was 14, dark-haired and serious, with a watchful quality that made her seem older than her years. Kate was 12, smaller and more delicate, with pale skin and large eyes that gave her an otherworldly appearance even before the spirits came. The noises began in late March of 1848. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A knocking in the walls could be explained by the settling of old timber, by the contraction of boards in the cold. A rapping sound could be a loose shutter, a branch against the window, a rat in the walls. But the sounds did not behave like natural phenomena. They came in patterns, they repeated, and most unsettling of all, they seemed to respond. On the night of March the 31st, 1848, the disturbances reached a crescendo. The family had gone to bed early, exhausted by sleepless nights and frayed nerves. But sleep would not come. The knocking started almost immediately, loud and insistent, echoing through the wall of the small house. Margaret Fox lit a candle and went to check on her daughters, finding them in their shared bed, clutching each other and staring wide-eyed at the ceiling. Kate, the younger girl, sat up. In the flickering candlelight, her face was very pale. "Mr. Splitfoot," she said, addressing the invisible presence by a name children used for the devil. "Do as I do." And she clapped her hands, once, twice, 3 times. The knocking answered. Once, twice, 3 times. Maggie tried next, clapping a different rhythm. The knocking duplicated it exactly. Their mother, trembling now, asked the presence to count to 10. It did, rapping out each number with precision. She asked it to tell her the ages of her children, and the knocking obliged, giving the correct number for each one, including the children who no longer lived at home, and then falling silent. A longer silence. And then, unbidden, 3 more raps. For the 3 children who had died. That detail, the unsolicited knowledge of the dead children, convinced Margaret Fox that she was not dealing with a natural phenomenon. She had told no one in Hydesville about those losses. They were private griefs carried quietly, yet the presence knew. She called in the neighbours. Within an hour, the small house was crowded with people from the surrounding farms, men in work clothes and women in nightgowns, all standing in the dim rooms, listening to the knocking and asking their own questions. The presence answered. It claimed to be the spirit of a man who'd been murdered in the house 5 years earlier, a peddler whose body had been buried in the cellar. The next day, John Fox and several neighbours dug in the cellar. They found fragments of bone, strands of hair, and what appeared to be remnants of a peddler's tin goods buried in the dirt floor. It was not conclusive proof of murder, but it was enough to give weight to the story. The Fox sisters had somehow made contact with the dead. Word spread with astonishing speed. Visitors came from neighbouring towns. The family was overwhelmed. The knocking followed the girls wherever they went, no longer confined to the Hydesville house, but manifesting in other homes, in public buildings, wherever Maggie and Kate were present. By the summer of 1848, the Fox sisters had been taken in by their older sister Leah, who lived in Rochester. Leah was 34, a widow and music teacher, shrewd and ambitious in ways her younger sisters were not. She recognised opportunity. She organised the first public demonstrations of the rappings, charging admission, carefully controlling the environment. The girls sat on a stage while the audience listened to the knocking and asked questions. Skeptics came determined to expose fraud. They examined the stage, the girls' clothing, their shoes. They had the girls stand on pillows, on glass, on cushions that would muffle any sound produced by trickery. The knocking continued. Explanations proliferated. Some said the girls were cracking their toe joints, producing the rapping sounds through deliberate manipulation of their own bodies. Some said it was ventriloquism, though ventriloquism could not account for knocking sounds in walls and furniture distant from the girls. Some claimed it was a hoax, but could not demonstrate how the hoax was accomplished. And some, a growing number, believed the girls were genuine mediums, channels through which the spirits communicated. The Fox sisters became famous. They travelled to New York City, to Philadelphia, to Boston. They gave séances in private homes and public halls. They were interviewed by journalists, examined by doctors, investigated by committees of skeptics. The verdict was always divided. Some denounced them as frauds. Others were convinced of their authenticity. Horace Greeley, the prominent newspaper editor, became a supporter, hosting the sisters in his home and writing favourably about them in the New York Tribune. William Cullen Bryant, the poet, attended a séance and came away impressed. James Fenimore Cooper, the novelist, was less convinced but intrigued. The phenomenon they had unleashed spread far beyond their control. Mediums appeared in dozens of cities, claiming to have developed the same gifts. Most were young women, often from working class or lower middle class backgrounds, who discovered that spirit communication offered a path to income and attention otherwise unavailable to them. The séance became a profession, a calling, a means of survival, and the demand was inexhaustible. America in the 1840s was a nation convulsed by change and loss. The war with Mexico had ended in 1848, bringing new territories and new conflicts over slavery. The California gold rush began the same year, sending thousands westward, many of whom would never return. Disease was rampant. Life expectancy was low. Nearly every family had buried children. The consolations offered by traditional religion felt inadequate to many. The idea that the dead were not gone but accessible, that they could speak and offer guidance and reassure the living of an afterlife was profoundly appealing. The Fox sisters performed thousands of séances over the following decades. They grew wealthy, then lost their wealth. They married and divorced. They struggled with alcoholism and depression. The fame that had come so suddenly in their youth became a burden. They were trapped by their own success, unable to escape the role of medium, unable to live ordinary lives. And they were haunted, always, by the question of whether what they did was real. In 1888, 40 years after the first rappings in Hydesville, Margaret Fox appeared at the New York Academy of Music before an audience of 2,000 people. She was 54 years old, her face lined and weary. She had come to make a confession. The rappings, she announced, were a fraud. She and Kate had produced the sounds themselves by cracking the joints in their toes and knees. She demonstrated that the technique on stage, removing her shoe and producing a sharp knocking sound with her foot. The audience was stunned. Some felt vindicated in their skepticism. Others felt betrayed. But the confession was not the end of the story. A year later, Margaret recanted. She claimed she had been coerced into the confession, that she had been desperate for money and had been paid to discredit spiritualism. She insisted the rappings were real, that the spirits were genuine. She returned to giving séances. Kate never made a public confession and continued to work as a medium until her death in 1892. Margaret died the following year, penniless and alone. The truth of what happened in that Hydesville house in 1848 remains ambiguous. Whether the Fox sisters were gifted mediums or talented performers, whether they were frauds or believers who sometimes resorted to trickery to meet audience expectations, cannot be definitively determined. What is certain is that they sparked a movement that transformed the spiritual landscape of the 19th century. They gave grief-stricken families hope. They challenged religious orthodoxy. They created a space where women could speak with authority and earn their own income. They changed the way millions of people thought about death. And they demonstrated something that would become central to spiritualism, that the line between belief and deception, between genuine experience and theatrical illusion, was far more permeable than anyone wanted to admit. The séance was both a spiritual practice and a performance. The medium was both a holy vessel and a skilled actress. And the sitters, desperate for contact with the dead, were willing participants in a drama that required them to suspend disbelief, to accept ambiguity, to find meaning in darkness and uncertainty. The Fox sisters were the first, but they would not be the last. The rappings they produced, whether by spirit agency or human ingenuity, opened a door that would never fully close. And on Halloween nights, in parlors throughout England and America, that door would open wider still, inviting the living to reach across the veil and touch, just for a moment, the hands of the beloved dead. Chapter 4. The Medium's Art. The medium was both a profession and a performance, a calling and a craft. Those who practiced it successfully understood that they were not merely channeling spirits, but managing expectations, reading audiences, and orchestrating experiences that would satisfy the deep psychological needs of their clients. The best mediums were keen observers of human nature, students of grief and longing, and masters of theatrical technique. They operated in the liminal space between religion and entertainment, between consolation and exploitation, and their success depended on their ability to navigate that space with apparent sincerity. The foundational skill of any medium was what would later be called cold reading, though the Victorians had no such term for it. It was the art of gathering information about a sitter without appearing to do so, and then presenting that information back as if it had been revealed by spirits. A medium would observe everything about a person who entered her parlour. The quality and cut of their clothing indicated social class and recent changes in fortune. Mourning dress revealed recent bereavement, and the depth of mourning, full black, half mourning in grey or purple, suggested how much time had passed since the loss. Rings were examined. A new wedding band on a woman's hand suggested marriage. The absence of a ring where one had clearly been worn suggested widowhood or divorce. Jewellery often held clues. A locket might contain a photograph or lock of hair. A brooch in the shape of a cross suggested religious devotion. A Masonic pin indicated fraternal affiliations. The medium listened carefully to every word spoken before the séance began. In casual conversation, people revealed the names of their loved ones, their occupations, their places of origin, their hopes and fears. A skilled medium would file away these details and produce them later, during the séance, as if the spirits had whispered them. Even the questions people asked provided information. A woman who asked repeatedly about a child was likely mourning a son or daughter. A man who wanted to know about forgiveness was likely carrying guilt. The medium learned to hear what was not said as clearly as what was spoken aloud. Confederates were sometimes employed, though mediums rarely admitted it. A servant in the household, a clerk in a hotel, anyone who had access to correspondence or personal effects could provide valuable intelligence. In cities where mediums operated regularly, networks of informants developed. Information was traded, sold, shared among practitioners. A medium in New York might receive word that a wealthy widow from Boston was travelling south, seeking contact with her deceased husband. By the time the widow arrived and arranged a sitting, the medium would already know her name, her husband's name, the circumstances of his death, and the details of his will. When the spirits spoke, they would speak with uncanny accuracy. Physical mediumship required different skills. The production of raps, table movements, spiritans, and other phenomena demanded dexterity, practice, and a willingness to embrace deception in service of a greater emotional truth. Many mediums justified their use of trickery by arguing that the spirits were real, but sometimes needed assistance to manifest. If the spiritual energy in the room was weak, if the sitters were skeptical, if conditions were not ideal, then the medium was obligated to supplement genuine phenomena with manufactured effects to maintain faith and provide consolation. The rapping sounds, which had begun with the Fox sisters, could be produced in numerous ways. Toe joints could indeed be cracked to create sharp knocking sounds, though this required practice and caused considerable pain over time. Knee joints worked as well. A small wooden device concealed in the medium's clothing could be clicked with subtle movements. An accomplice hidden behind a wall panel or beneath the floor could produce knocks on cue. The medium would develop signals, a particular phrase, a cough, a shift in posture, that told the confederate when to rap and how many times. Table tipping and levitation were achieved through collective pressure and leverage. When multiple people pressed down on a table with their hands, slight variations in pressure could cause the table to rock or tilt. If the sitters unconsciously coordinated their movements, the table could appear to move of its own accord. More dramatic levitations required preparation. Tables with hidden mechanisms with legs that could be extended or retracted were sometimes used. In darkened rooms, a medium could use her own legs and feet to lift a lightweight table, while her hands remained visible on the surface. Confederates could assist, using dark rods or wires to lift furniture while remaining unseen in the shadows. The floating trumpet, glowing with phosphorescent paint, was typically manipulated by the medium herself using a telescoping rod held in her teeth or concealed in her sleeve. In the darkness, with attention focused on the glowing object, the mechanism remained invisible. The voices that emerged from the trumpet were produced by the medium or an accomplice using ventriloquism, or simply speaking from different positions in the room. The distortion caused by speaking through the metal cone made it difficult to identify the true source of the sound. Spirit hands were among the most tactile and convincing phenomena. They could be created using inflated rubber gloves coated with luminous paint, manipulated by the medium or a confederate using dark rods. When these cold, slightly damp hands touched the faces of sitters in the darkness, the effect was profoundly unsettling. Some mediums used their own hands and feet, removing their shoes silently and reaching out to touch sitters while their visible hands remained in the circle. Victorian clothing, with its layers and loose sleeves, provided excellent cover for such maneuvers. Ectoplasm was perhaps the most theatrical of all phenomena. The glowing, gauzy substance that appeared to extrude from the medium's body was typically cheesecloth, muslin, or silk that had been soaked in luminous paint and then concealed on the medium's person. The medium swallowed the fabric and regurgitated it during the séance, producing the appearance of materialization from within. Others hid it in body cavities or in specially designed undergarments. The substance would be produced gradually, manipulated to form vague shapes, and then drawn back and concealed before the lights were raised. Photographs of ectoplasm, taken in dim light with long exposures, captured these gauzy masses and seemed to provide evidence of genuine materialization. Spirit photography was a related phenomenon that flourished in the 1860s and 70s. Photographers claimed to capture images of the dead appearing alongside the living. The techniques were relatively simple. Double exposure could superimpose one image onto another, creating the appearance of a translucent figure standing behind a sitter. Pre-exposed plates could be used, with ghostly images already on the negative before the customer ever entered the studio. Muslin-draped accomplices could pose as spirits during the exposure, then slip away before the photograph was fully developed. The resulting images were eerie and compelling, showing bereaved parents with the faint forms of their children hovering nearby, widows with their husbands standing behind them, hands resting on shoulders that could no longer feel. William Mumler was the most famous spirit photographer in America. He began producing such images in Boston in 1861 and quickly built a substantial business. His most famous photograph was of Mary Todd Lincoln, taken in 1872, which appeared to show the late President Abraham Lincoln standing behind his widow, his hands on her shoulders. Mary Todd Lincoln believed the photograph was genuine. Others were less convinced. Mumler was eventually tried for fraud in 1869, but was acquitted due to lack of conclusive evidence. He continued his practice until his death, never admitting deception, but never satisfactorily explaining how his images were produced. Slate writing was another popular method of spirit communication. 2 blank slates would be cleaned and examined by the sitters, then bound together with a small piece of chalk trapped between them. The slates would be placed on the table or held beneath it, and after a few minutes, when they were opened, a message would appear written on one of the inner surfaces. The trick required preparation. A fake slate bottom could be used, with a message already written on the hidden surface. Sleight of hand during the binding process could substitute a prepared slate for a blank one. Chemical solutions that appeared invisible when first applied, but darkened over time, could be used to write messages that developed during the séance. The messages were typically brief and cryptic, but for a believer they were proof of spirit intervention. Automatic writing was a less theatrical but equally compelling phenomenon. The medium would hold a pen or pencil loosely, allowing her hand to move across paper without conscious guidance. The writing that emerged was often illegible at first, wild scrawls and loop, but would gradually resolve into words and sentences. The messages were attributed to spirits guiding the medium's hand. In reality, automatic writing is a well-documented psychological phenomenon in which unconscious thoughts find expression through motor activity. The medium was writing her own thoughts but experiencing them as alien, as coming from an external source. The effect was genuinely dissociative and could be subjectively convincing even to the medium herself. Trance mediumship was perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of the medium's art. In trance, the medium appeared to lose consciousness and to be possessed by a spirit entity who spoke through her. The medium's face would go slack, her voice would change in pitch and accent, her vocabulary and manner of speaking would shift. She would deliver messages in the persona of the spirit, addressing sitters directly, answering questions, providing comfort and guidance. Some trance mediums were conscious performers, fully aware that they were playing a role. They studied accents and vocal patterns, developed distinct spirit personalities, and memorized information about their clients to make the performance more convincing. Others may have entered genuine altered states, using self-hypnosis or dissociation to create a psychological condition in which they believe themselves to be possessed. The line between conscious fraud and unconscious self-deception was not always clear. Many mediums probably operated in a grey area, sometimes performing deliberately, and sometimes experiencing genuine dissociative episodes that they interpreted as spiritual possession. The most successful mediums developed spirit guides, recurring personalities who served as intermediaries between the medium and other spirits. These guides had names, backstories, distinctive voices and mannerisms. One of the most famous was John King, a spirit who claimed to have been Henry Morgan, the 17th century pirate, and who manifested through numerous mediums in both America and England. Another was Katie King, allegedly the daughter of John King, who materialized for the medium Florence Cook in elaborate full-body apparitions that were investigated and endorsed by the prominent scientist Sir William Crookes. The relationship between Florence Cook and William Crookes remains one of the most controversial episodes in spiritualist history. Crookes was a distinguished chemist and physicist, a Fellow of the Royal Society, who took a serious interest in investigating spiritualist phenomena. Between 1871 and 1874, he conducted extensive tests of Florence Cook's mediumship, particularly her ability to materialize the spirit Katie King. During séances held in Crookes's own home, Katie King would emerge from the cabinet where Florence sat entranced, walking among the sitters, speaking with them, allowing herself to be touched and examined. Crookes took numerous photographs of Katie King and testified that she was a distinct physical entity, different in appearance from Florence Cook. Skeptics suggested that Katie King was simply Florence Cook in disguise, wearing white robes and playing the role of her own spirit guide. Some went further and suggested that Crookes had been romantically involved with the young medium and was complicit in the deception. Crookes never wavered in his public support for Florence Cook's mediumship, though he later acknowledged that conditions during the séances were not as strictly controlled as they should have been. The case demonstrated how even trained scientific observers could be deceived when they wanted to believe. The mediums themselves were a diverse group. Some were undoubtedly cynical frauds, motivated purely by profit and willing to exploit grief without remorse. Others were believers who saw themselves as performing a sacred service, helping the bereaved find peace, even if the methods were not entirely supernatural. Many were women from limited circumstances for whom mediumship offered rare opportunities for independence, income, and social influence. In an era when women could not vote, could not own property in many jurisdictions, could not enter most professions, the séance room was a space where a woman's voice carried authority. The medium spoke for the dead, and in doing so she spoke with power. She could advise wealthy patrons on business decisions, claiming the guidance came from their deceased fathers or partners. She could counsel women trapped in unhappy marriages, offering messages from departed relatives that supported seeking separation or asserting independence. She could validate the grief of parents who had lost children, assuring them that their suffering was seen and their love was not wasted. Whether the spirits were real or invented, the medium's role as counselor, confessor, and comforter was genuine. The art of mediumship was not static. It evolved over time, adapting to new technologies and new cultural expectations. When photography became widespread, spirit photography emerged. When the telegraph made instantaneous long-distance communication possible, mediums began speaking of spiritual telegraphs and etheric vibrations. When electricity was harnessed and demonstrated, mediums incorporated electrical metaphors into their explanations of spiritual energy. The séance was always contemporary, always speaking the language of its moment, always finding ways to make the supernatural seem plausible within the scientific and technological framework of the age. By the 1870s, when spiritualism had been thriving for more than 2 decades, the medium's techniques were sophisticated and well developed. The theatrical infrastructure of the séance, the darkened room, the linked hands, the props and confederates, had been refined through thousands of performances. The psychological understanding of what made a séance convincing had deepened. Mediums knew how to create atmosphere, how to build tension, how to deliver messages that would resonate emotionally, even if they were ambiguous factually. They knew that grief made people vulnerable, that hope made them credulous, that the desire for a reunion with the dead was strong enough to overcome skepticism, and they knew that Halloween, that ancient threshold night when the boundaries between worlds were believed to thin, was the perfect occasion for their art. On October the 31st, when the veil was said to be at its most transparent, when the dead were closest to the living, the séance became something more than performance. It became ritual, tradition, a communion that satisfied needs deeper than logic or evidence could address. The medium, in her darkened parlor, became priestess of a new mystery religion, one that promised not salvation in the next world, but connection between this world and the next. Chapter 5, All Hallows Eve in the Old World. Long before the Victorian Séance, long before gaslight and railway trains and the mediums who summoned spirits in darkened parlours, there was Samhain. It was the Celtic festival that marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter, celebrated on the night when October became November, when the warm half of the year yielded to the cold. Samhain was a hinge in time, a moment when the normal order of things became unstable, when boundaries dissolved and the impossible became briefly possible, and chief among those boundaries was the one between the living and the dead. The Celts who inhabited Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and parts of what would become England and France understood the year as a wheel divided into light and dark. Samhain was the moment of greatest darkness, the descent into winter, when the sun grew weak and the night stretched long, and the earth itself seemed to die. It was a time of transition, and therefore a time of danger. The spirits of the dead, who ordinarily remained in their own realm, could cross over. The fairy folk who dwelt in their hollow hills could emerge and walk among mortals. Malevolent entities could slip through the thinned veil and work mischief or worse. To protect themselves, the people performed rituals that were part propitiation and part celebration. Great bonfires were lit on hilltops, flames that could be seen for miles, pushing back the darkness and purifying the community. The household fires were extinguished and then rekindled from the sacred Samhain fire, symbolizing renewal and continuity. Cattle were driven between 2 bonfires to bless them and protect them through the coming winter. People leapt over the flames for luck and purification. Bones of slaughtered livestock were thrown into the fire, hence bone fire, the origin of the word bonfire. Feasts were prepared, great communal meals that honoured the dead and invited them to partake. A place was set at the table for the ancestors, and food was left out for them. This was not mere symbolism. The belief that the dead returned on Samhain night was literal and widespread. They came back to the homes they had known in life, to warm themselves at the fire, to share in the food to see how their descendants fared. Some of these returning spirits were benevolent, protective presences. Others were restless, angry, hungry in ways that food could not satisfy. To distinguish between living and dead, to confuse malevolent spirits, or perhaps to honour them, people wore costumes. They disguised themselves as animals or supernatural beings, donning masks and hides. This practice served multiple purposes. It allowed the living to move safely through a night when spirits walked abroad. It enabled them to embody the spirits themselves, to take on their power and their perspective. And it created a carnivalesque inversion of normal social order, a brief period when rules were suspended and identities could be fluid. Divination was practiced extensively on Samhain night. It was a time when the future could be glimpsed, when knowledge ordinarily hidden became accessible. Young women performed rituals to learn the identity of their future husbands. Apples and nuts, the fruits of the autumn harvest, were used in fortune-telling. An apple peel thrown over the shoulder would land in the shape of a future lover's initial. Nuts placed in the fire would pop and crack, revealing the information about romantic prospects. Mirrors were gazed into at midnight, and in their depths, some claimed to see visions of what was to come. The dead were consulted directly. In Ireland, people would visit burial mounds and fairy hills on Samhain night, calling out questions and listening for answers in the wind. Offerings were left at crossroads, liminal spaces where the worlds intersected. Some brave or foolish souls would sit at crossroads all night, waiting to see what passed. To encounter a spirit on Samhain night was dangerous but not necessarily fatal. If treated with proper respect, if given offerings, if addressed correctly, the dead might provide information, might grant favours, might even offer protection. The Christian Church, when it spread through Celtic lands, attempted to suppress Samhain, but found it too deeply rooted to eliminate entirely. Instead, the Church adapted it, overlaying Christian meaning onto pagan practice. In the 8th century, Pope Gregory III designated November 1st as All Saints' Day, a holy day honouring all Christian saints and martyrs. The night before became All Hallows Eve, the evening before the hallowed day. November 2nd was designated All Souls' Day, a day to pray for the souls of the dead in purgatory. The 3 days together, Hallowtide, echoed the structure of Samhain, acknowledging the special relationship between the living and the dead at this dark turning of the year. But the old beliefs persisted beneath the Christian veneer. In medieval and early modern Britain, Halloween remained a night of ghosts and spirits, of bonfires and divination, of fear and festivity intermingled. In Scotland, the night was called All Hallows Eve, and it retained strong associations with supernatural danger. People believed that witches met on Halloween night, that the devil himself walked abroad, that the spirits of the damned could be encountered on lonely roads. Church bells were rung to drive away evil spirits, prayers were said for protection, salt and iron, ancient charms against supernatural harm were kept close at hand. The tradition of souling emerged in medieval England. Poor people, especially children, would go door to door on Halloween and All Souls' Day, offering to pray for the dead in exchange for soul cakes, small round cakes marked with a cross. The practice was a form of ritualized begging sanctioned by custom and religious duty. The soulers would sing songs and perform simple plays. Householders gave them food and drink, and in return the soulers promised to pray for the donor's deceased relatives, helping to speed their passage through purgatory. This was a precursor to the modern practice of trick-or-treating, though its religious context would eventually be lost. In Ireland and Scotland, the practice of guising developed. Children and young adults would dress in costumes and go from house to house, performing songs, poems, or tricks in exchange for food or coins. The costumes often represented spirits or supernatural creatures, ghosts, fairies, demons. The performance aspect was important. It was not enough merely to appear in costume and demand treats. Entertainment had to be provided. A song had to be sung, a joke told, a rhyme recited. This tradition would eventually cross the Atlantic with Irish and Scottish immigrants and evolve into the American Halloween custom. The carved turnip lantern was another tradition with deep roots. In Ireland and Scotland, turnips or other root vegetables were hollowed out and carved with grotesque faces, then lit from within with candles or coals. These jack-o'-lanterns were placed in windows or carried through the darkness to ward off evil spirits. The light within the carved face represented a soul trapped between worlds, neither fully alive nor fully dead. The grotesque face was meant to frighten away malevolent entities. When Irish immigrants came to America in the 19th century, they found pumpkins more abundant and easier to carve than turnips, and the jack-o'-lantern tradition adapted accordingly. By the Victorian era, Halloween in Britain had become a curious mixture of old superstition and modern festivity. In rural areas, the older traditions persisted with relatively little change. Bonfires were still lit, divination games were still played. The night was still regarded with a certain wariness, a sense that ordinary rules did not quite apply. But in cities, among the educated middle and upper classes, Halloween was increasingly treated as an occasion for parties and entertainments rather than genuine spiritual observance. Halloween parties in Victorian Britain featured games that had their origins in divination, but were now played for amusement. Bobbing for apples, trying to catch an apple floating in water using only one's teeth, was originally a form of divination related to marriage prospects. Snap Apple, a game where an apple was suspended on a string, and participants tried to bite it, had similar origins. These games were now divorced from their supernatural context and played simply for fun, though a faint awareness of their earlier meanings lingered. Ghost stories became a central feature of Victorian Halloween celebrations. Families and friends would gather in dimly lit parlors and take turns telling tales of haunted houses, vengeful spirits, and supernatural encounters. These stories drew on a long tradition of British ghost lore, but were shaped by Victorian sensibilities and anxieties. The Victorian ghost story was typically set in a country house or ancient manor, featured a wronged spirit seeking justice or revenge, and ended with moral instruction. The ghost was a manifestation of guilt, a reminder of past sins, a disruption of the rational order that demanded to be acknowledged and resolved. The popularity of ghost stories on Halloween reflected a broader Victorian fascination with death and mourning. The Victorians ritualised death in elaborate ways. Mourning had strict rules about clothing, behaviour and duration. The dead were photographed, sometimes posed as if sleeping. Locks of hair were woven into jewellery. Elaborate monuments were erected in cemeteries. Death was simultaneously feared and romanticised, treated as both ending and transformation. Halloween, with its ancient associations with the dead returning, fit naturally into this cultural preoccupation. But the Victorian embrace of Halloween was also tinged with nostalgia and antiquarianism. Educated Victorians were aware that many Halloween customs were survivals from a pre-Christian past, remnants of pagan Britain. This gave the holiday an additional appeal. It connected the present to a distant, half-mythical past. It evoked a time when England was rural and agrarian, before industrialisation and urbanisation had transformed the landscape. Halloween became a way to remember and reenact a version of history that was rapidly disappearing. The same impulse that drove the Victorian fascination with Halloween, the desire for connection with the past, the sense that modernity had severed important links with tradition and mystery, also fueled the Spiritualist movement. Both Halloween and Spiritualism offered ways to bridge the chasm between present and past, between living and dead, between the rational daylight world and the darker, more mysterious realm of spirits and shadows. The Séance, in many ways, was a Victorian reinvention of ancient Halloween traditions, adapted for a modern age that no longer believed in bonfires and fairy hills, but still longed for contact with the other side. When British spiritualists held séances on Halloween night, they were participating in a double tradition. On one hand, they were following the relatively new practices of American mediumship, using the techniques and language that had developed over the previous 2 decades. On the other hand, they were tapping into something far older, the Celtic belief that on this particular night, the veil between worlds grew thin. The séance on Halloween was not merely another evening's entertainment. It was a ritual observance, a recognition that this night was different, that spirits who might not respond at other times would be present and accessible now. The medium conducting a Halloween séance would often acknowledge the special significance of the date. She might invoke the ancient traditions referring to Samhain or All Hallows Eve, reminding the sitters that for thousands of years this night had been recognised as a time when the dead walked among the living. This invocation served to heighten expectation and deepen the atmosphere of the séance. It suggested that what was about to occur was not merely a parlour trick, but a participation in an ancient mystery. The spirits summoned on Halloween were believed to be more powerful, more willing to manifest, more capable of dramatic phenomena. Mediums reported that their abilities were enhanced on this night, that the spirits came more readily, that the messages were clearer and the materializations more vivid. Whether this was true or simply the effect of heightened expectation is impossible to determine, but the belief itself shaped the experience. Sitters came to Halloween séances expecting extraordinary phenomena, and that expectation made them more receptive, more willing to interpret ambiguous events as supernatural, more likely to have profound emotional responses. In Ireland and Scotland, where the old traditions remained strongest, Halloween séances sometimes incorporated elements of the older practices. Offerings of food might be set out for the spirits before the séance began. Rituals from Celtic tradition might be performed alongside the newer spiritualist protocols. The séance circle might be cast in a manner that echoed pre-Christian protective magic. These syncretisms created a hybrid practice that belonged fully to neither the ancient past nor the modern present, but drew power from both. The Victorian Halloween, then, was a liminal thing itself, part Christian holy day, part pagan festival, part modern entertainment, part ancient ritual. It was a night when the rational order that governed Victorian society could be set aside, when spirits could be summoned, when the dead could speak, when the past could reach into the present and make its presence felt. And for those who sat in darkened parlours on October the 31st, holding hands around a table, waiting for the knocking to begin, Halloween was the one night of the year when the impossible seemed not only possible but likely, when the veil truly did seem thin, and when the whisper of the beloved dead felt close enough to touch. Chapter 6. The Believers and the Bereaved. The woman who came to the séance on Halloween night, 1872, was 43 years old and dressed in full mourning. Her gown was black silk, unrelieved by any ornament, with a high collar and long sleeves that covered her from throat to wrist. Her gloves were black, her bonnet was black, with a heavy veil that obscured her face. She had been in mourning for 2 years, 3 months, and 17 days, though those who did not know her could not have guessed how precisely she counted the time. She moved slowly, as if the weight of her grief were physical, as if it pressed down on her shoulders and made every step an effort. Her name was Eleanor Thornton, and she had lost her only son. William had been 19 when the fever took him, a student at Cambridge, bright and healthy until he was not. The illness had come suddenly. Within a week, he was dead. Eleanor had not been there when he died. She had been in London, attending to household matters, believing him safe among his tutors and friends. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. She had stood in her parlour reading the words over and over, unable to make them mean what they plainly said. Your son William passed peacefully this morning. Funeral arrangements await your instruction. She had gone to Cambridge, had claimed his body, had brought him home to be buried in the family plot. She had done everything expected of her, had followed every rule of mourning with meticulous care, but the rituals had brought no comfort. The black clothing, the withdrawal from society, the prescribed year of seclusion, none of it lessened the weight in her chest, the hollow feeling that had replaced her heart. Her husband had returned to his business after a few months, unable or unwilling to inhabit grief as she did. They no longer spoke of William. The house where he had grown up felt like a mausoleum. Eleanor had heard of mediums before. She had dismissed them as charlatans preying on the vulnerable, but desperation had worn away her skepticism. She needed to know if William still existed somewhere, in some form. She needed to hear his voice, even if it came through the lips of a stranger. She needed proof that the 19 years of his life had not simply vanished, that he was not utterly gone, and so she had written to Mrs. Henrietta Graves, a medium whose reputation for communicating with the recently deceased had reached even those circles that ordinarily scorned spiritualism. Mrs. Graves had invited her to attend a séance on Halloween night. "The veil is thinnest then," she had written in her reply. "Your son will be close, drawn by your love and the power of this sacred night. Come, and I believe he will speak to you." Eleanor had told no one where she was going. She had left her house in Bloomsbury as dusk fell, had taken a cab to Belgrave Square, and had been admitted to Mrs. Graves's residence by a silent maid who took her cloak and led her upstairs to the séance room. 6 others were already present. Eleanor took her seat without looking closely at any of them. She did not want to know their names or their stories. Her grief was private, and she intended to keep it so. Mrs. Graves entered a few moments later, wearing her customary black silken veil. She welcomed the sitters in a soft voice, reminded them to maintain the circle no matter what occurred, and asked them each to think of the spirit they most wished to contact. Eleanor closed her eyes and thought of William. She thought of his face, his laugh, the way he had looked the last time she saw him alive, waving from the train platform as he departed for Cambridge. She thought of him so hard that everything else ceased to exist. The gas lamps were extinguished. The candles on the mantelpiece provided only the faintest light. The sitters linked hands. Mrs. Graves began her invocation, calling upon the spirits to draw near to make their presence known. The room grew cold. Eleanor felt it seeping through her clothing, settling into her bones. And then came the knocking. 3 sharp raps on the table. Mrs. Graves asked if a spirit was present. 1 knock for yes. She asked if the spirit wished to communicate with someone in the circle. 1 knock. She went around the table, speaking to each sitter in turn, asking if the spirit was there for them. When she reached Eleanor, the knocking came loudly, emphatically. Yes, yes, yes. Eleanor's hands tightened on those of her neighbours. Her breathing had stopped. Mrs. Graves was speaking, asking the spirit to identify itself, to give a sign. The table began to move, rocking gently at first and then more violently, tilting up on 2 legs and thumping back down. Mrs. Graves's voice changed. It became higher, younger. "Mother," the voice said. "Mother, it is I." Eleanor made a sound that was not quite a word. Mrs. Graves, still speaking in that other voice, continued, "Mother, do not weep. I am well. I am not alone. There is light here, such light, and I am no longer in pain. I am sorry you were not with me at the end. I called for you, but I am not angry. I understand. Please, Mother, you must forgive yourself." The words struck Eleanor like physical blows. She had not told Mrs. Graves about her absence from William's deathbed. She had told no one. The guilt she carried was hers alone. Yet here was her son, or a voice claiming to be her son, speaking the very words she needed to hear. "William?" she whispered. "William, is it truly you?" "It is, Mother. I am here. I have been watching over you. I see you wearing black, living in darkness. You must not. I am in light. I want you to live, Mother. I want you to find joy again. Can you do that for me? Can you live?" Eleanor was weeping now, silently, tears streaming down her face behind the veil. She wanted to believe. She needed to believe. The voice continued, offering details that seemed to prove its authenticity. It mentioned the cricket bat William had treasured as a boy, the poem he had written for her birthday when he was 10, the way he used to whistle a particular tune when he was content. It mentioned his friend Thomas from Cambridge and the argument they had had the week before he died, and his regret that he had not apologised. The séance lasted an hour. The voice of William, speaking through Mrs. Graves, offered comfort and reassurance and love. He told Eleanor that death was not an ending but a transition, that he existed still in a realm more real than the physical world, that they would be reunited when her time came, but that she must not hasten that time. She must live fully, honour his memory through her life rather than her mourning. He told her he loved her, that he had always loved her, that death had not changed that. When the séance ended and the gas lamps were relit, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in 2 years. The weight had not vanished, but it had shifted. She believed she had spoken to her son. She believed he still existed. She believed she would see him again. Mrs. Graves, emerging from her trance, looked exhausted and pale. She claimed to remember nothing of what had been said. Eleanor pressed money into her hands, far more than the séance fee, and whispered her gratitude. Eleanor Thornton was one of thousands. The bereaved came to the séance room carrying grief that could not be spoken aloud, could not be shared, could not be resolved through ordinary means. They came because the church offered only distant abstraction, heaven, resurrection, the communion of saints, that did not address the specific ache of losing this particular person. The séance offered something more immediate. It offered proof, it offered a conversation, it offered the illusion, or perhaps the reality of presence. Mothers who had lost children were the most frequent and devoted clients of mediums. In an era when infant and child mortality remained high despite medical advances, almost every family knew the grief of a small coffin. The Victorian culture of mourning had elaborate protocols for adult deaths, but the death of a child occupied a special category of pain. Children were increasingly sentimentalized in Victorian culture, seen as innocent, pure, too good for this fallen world. Their deaths were both tragedy and, in some religious interpretations, a kind of blessing. They were spared the corruption of adulthood and taken directly to heaven. But this theological comfort was cold to mothers who wanted their children in their arms, not in paradise. The séance room allowed these mothers to hold their children again, if only through words. Mediums specialized in producing child voices, high and sweet, calling Mama and Papa through the darkness. They delivered messages of happiness, describing heaven as a beautiful garden where children played together under the watchful eye of angels. They assured grieving parents that their children were not suffering, not lonely, not afraid. They said the children were growing up in the spirit world, learning and developing, waiting for the day when the family would be reunited. For fathers, the appeal of the séance was often different. Victorian masculinity did not easily accommodate public displays of grief. A man was expected to be stoic, to bear loss with dignity, to provide strength for his family. But the séance room, darkened and private, you must, allowed for emotional expression that would be impossible elsewhere. Men wept in séances, asked desperate questions, pleaded for signs that their children or wives or parents still existed. The darkness and the theatrical quality of the experience provided cover for feelings that could not be acknowledged in daylight. Widows formed another large constituency of believers. The Victorian widow was a figure of pathos and social significance. She was expected to mourn intensely and publicly, to wear black for years, to withdraw from society, to dedicate herself to the memory of her husband. Many widows found this role suffocating. The séance offered an alternative. If her husband still existed, still cared for her, still communicated with her, then she was not alone. She was still a wife, even if her husband was discarnate. The relationship continued, transformed but not severed. For some widows, the séance provided guidance on practical matters. Mediums delivered messages from deceased husbands advising their widows on financial decisions, property sales, investments. Skeptics noted that this advice sometimes benefited the medium or her associates. But for widows who had been excluded from business matters during their marriages, who found themselves suddenly responsible for affairs they did not understand, the reassurance that they were following their husband's wishes was valuable regardless of the advice's actual source. Young women came to séances seeking contact with deceased lovers or fiancés. The Victorian period saw numerous wars: the Crimean War, various colonial conflicts, the American Civil War, that claimed young men's lives far from home. A girl who had lost her sweetheart to war carried a grief that was not quite legitimate in the eyes of society. She was not a widow, had no official status, no claim to public mourning. The séance gave her a space to grieve, to maintain the relationship, to receive messages of continued devotion from beyond the grave. The bereaved brought to the séance room not only grief but guilt. They brought the things they had left unsaid, the arguments unresolved, the apologies unoffered. Death fixed relationships in place, crystallizing the last interaction, the last words spoken, the last feelings expressed. Those who had parted from the deceased in anger or coldness carried that as an open wound. The séance allowed for reconciliation. Spirits speaking through mediums offered forgiveness, accepted apologies, healed ruptures that death had seemed to make permanent. This was perhaps the most powerful service mediums provided. Not proof of survival, not evidence of an afterlife, but the opportunity to revise the narrative of a relationship to achieve closure that life had not permitted. Whether the spirit was genuinely present or whether the medium was simply telling her clients what they needed to hear, the effect was the same. The weight of guilt was lifted. The bereaved could move forward. But not everyone found solace in the séance room. Some came desperate for contact and received nothing. The spirits did not respond to their calls. The medium could not produce the specific details they sought. The messages delivered were too vague, too generic, clearly applicable to anyone. These failures were devastating. The séance had promised connection and delivered only emptiness. For these unfortunate souls, the séance confirmed rather than alleviated their worst fears, that the dead were truly gone, that there was no afterlife, that grief had no remedy. Others came to believe they had made contact and found the experience disturbing rather than comforting. The spirit voices were not quite right. The vocabulary was wrong, the tone was off. The personality did not match memory. Some spirits delivered troubling messages, spoke of suffering or regret, or made demands the living could not fulfill. A few sitters became convinced they were being haunted rather than consoled, that the séance had opened a door they now could not close. There were also those who became dependent on the séance, who could not move forward with their lives because they were perpetually seeking one more message, one more sign, one more moment of contact. They spent their resources on mediums, attending séance after séance, chasing an experience that could never fully satisfy because it could never restore what had been lost. Mediums were accused of exploiting this dependency, of encouraging clients to return repeatedly rather than helping them find closure. Yet for all the deception, all the cold reading and theatrical trickery, all the manipulation of grief-stricken clients, the séance provided something that Victorian society otherwise lacked. A space where grief could be expressed, where the dead could be remembered aloud, where love and loss could be acknowledged without shame. The Victorian death cult, for all its elaborate rituals, was curiously silent about actual feelings. One wore black and observed the proper waiting periods, but one did not speak openly about anguish, about rage at death's unfairness, about the specific intimate loss of this particular person. The séance room, for all its darkness and deception, was a place where people could say the things they needed to say. I miss you. I'm sorry. I love you. Please come back. And in the darkness, through the medium's lips or through their own imagination, they heard answers. I am here. I forgive you. I love you still. We will meet again. Whether those answers came from the dead or from the deep wells of human need and invention, they served a purpose. They allowed the bereaved to continue living. They transformed unbearable grief into manageable sorrow. They provided a narrative of continuation rather than ending. And on Halloween night, when the veil was said to be thinnest, when centuries of tradition declared that the dead walked close to the living, the séance room became a place of genuine communion. If not with the dead themselves, then with the enduring human need to believe that love is stronger than death, that separation is temporary, that those we have lost are not entirely gone. Eleanor Thornton returned to Mrs. Graves' séance room many times over the following years. She never again heard William's voice as clearly as she had that first Halloween night, but she continued to receive messages, to feel his presence, to believe he was watching over her. Eventually she removed her mourning clothes and returned to society. She established a charity in William's name that provided scholarships for poor students. She found purpose in her grief, transformed her loss into something generative rather than merely destructive. Whether William's spirit truly spoke to her or whether Mrs. Graves was a skilled performer who understood the psychology of bereavement is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. But the outcome was real. Eleanor Thornton was saved from despair by her encounters in that darkened parlour. And she was not alone. Thousands of others, across Britain and America, across decades of spiritualist practice, found in the séance room a lifeline that pulled them back from the edge of inconsolable grief and allowed them to go on living. Chapter 7. The Frauds and the Faithful. The exposure came on a cold November evening in 1876 in a hired hall in Manchester. The medium was a woman named Clara Morrison, who had built a considerable reputation over the previous 3 years for her ability to produce full-body materializations of spirits. She worked in what was called cabinet mediumship, sitting concealed within a wooden cabinet draped with heavy curtains, while spirits allegedly emerged and walked among the sitters. The spirits appeared as luminous figures draped in white, their faces visible but indistinct, moving with an ethereal quality that believers found convincing. On this particular evening, a man named Richard Dawkins attended the séance. He was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, an organisation newly formed to investigate spiritualist phenomena with scientific rigour. Dawkins had attended several of Clara Morrison's séances and had grown suspicious. The spirits all seemed remarkably similar in height and build to the medium herself. Their movements, though meant to appear otherworldly, suggested an ordinary human body beneath the drapery, and on one occasion he'd noticed a peculiar detail. The spirit wore shoes that were visible beneath the hem of her white robe, shoes that looked identical to those the medium had been wearing when she entered the cabinet. Dawkins came to this November séance prepared. He brought with him a small bottle of phosphorescent powder and waited for his opportunity. When the spirit emerged from the cabinet and began moving through the circle of sitters, glowing faintly in the darkness, Dawkins reached out as if to touch the apparition in reverence, but his hand carried the powder, and as he brushed against the spirit's robe, he left a mark, a bright smear of phosphorescent material that clung to the fabric and glowed even more brightly than the robe itself. The spirit retreated quickly to the cabinet. The séance continued for another 20 minutes, with rapping sounds and the movement of objects in the darkness, but the materialized figure did not emerge. Again. When the séance concluded and the gas lamps were lit, Dawkins made his accusation. He demanded that Clara Morrison step from the cabinet and allow her clothing to be examined. She refused, claiming that the spiritual energy still clinging to her made such exposure dangerous. The argument grew heated. Other sitters, some of whom had paid substantial sums for the privilege of witnessing the phenomena, defended the medium against what they saw as an attack by a skeptic determined to destroy something sacred. But Dawkins was insistent, and he had allies in the room, other investigators from the society, who had attended specifically to test his theory. They surrounded the cabinet. Clara Morrison, trapped and frightened, finally emerged. She wore her ordinary black dress, but smeared across the bodice was a bright streak of phosphorescent powder, glowing unmistakably in the dimmed light. The evidence was undeniable. The spirit had been Clara Morrison herself, having changed quickly from her dark clothing into white drapery kept concealed in the cabinet, then performing her role as the ethereal visitor before changing back. The revelation destroyed Clara Morrison's career. The newspapers reported the exposure with gleeful detail. She was denounced as a charlatan and a thief, preying on the bereaved for profit. She left Manchester and was never heard from again in spiritualist circles. But the exposure did not destroy spiritualism itself. Within weeks, defenders of the movement had constructed explanations. Perhaps Clara Morrison had been genuine in the past, but had resorted to trickery on this occasion, when the spirits would not come. Perhaps the spirits themselves had required her to act as their physical vessel, wearing the white robe so they could overlay their essence upon her form. Perhaps the exposure was itself fraudulent, a conspiracy by materialists determined to suppress spiritual truth. The believers continued to believe, because their faith was not based primarily on evidence. It was based on need, on hope, on the powerful desire to maintain connection with the dead. One exposed fraud did not disprove the entire phenomenon. It merely proved that this particular medium on this particular night had cheated. Other mediums remained, other séances continued, and the faithful continued to attend them. The battle between believers and skeptics had been ongoing since the earliest days of spiritualism. Almost as soon as the Fox sisters began demonstrating their rapping phenomena, investigators attempted to determine how the sounds were produced. The very first committee to examine the girls in 1850 concluded that the rappings were genuine and could not be explained by ordinary means, but subsequent investigations were less favourable. Some observers claimed to detect movements of the girls' knees or ankles that coincided with the knocks. Others suggested ventriloquism or accomplices hidden in the walls. The controversy attracted the attention of scientists and scholars who saw in spiritualism both a potential breakthrough in understanding consciousness and the afterlife, and a dangerous delusion that needed to be combated. The debate cut across expected lines. It was not simply a matter of religious believers accepting spiritualism, while secular rationalists rejected it. Many devout Christians condemned spiritualism as demonic, as trafficking with forces explicitly forbidden in Scripture. Meanwhile, some scientists and intellectuals, far from being reflexively skeptical, approached spiritualist claims with genuine curiosity and openness. Alfred Russel Wallace, the naturalist who had independently arrived at the theory of evolution by natural selection alongside Charles Darwin, became a committed spiritualist after attending séances in the 1860s. He argued that spiritualist phenomena represented a new field of scientific inquiry, one that would ultimately reveal the existence of a spiritual dimension to reality that materialism had overlooked. He conducted his own investigations, attended hundreds of séances, and published defences of mediumship that drew on his scientific credentials. William Crookes, the chemist and physicist whose investigations of the medium Florence Cook had caused such controversy, similarly lent his scientific reputation to the spiritualist cause. Crookes conducted elaborate experiments with several mediums, using instruments to measure temperature changes, weight variations and other physical phenomena allegedly produced by spirits. He published his findings in respectable scientific journals, arguing that the phenomena were real and deserved serious investigation. His fellow scientists were largely unconvinced and suggested that Crookes had been deceived by attractive young female mediums who exploited his willingness to believe. But for every scientist who endorsed spiritualism, others dedicated themselves to exposing it. The most effective skeptics were often stage magicians, men who understood theatrical illusion and could recognize when they were witnessing skilled performance rather than supernatural phenomena. John Neville Maskelyne was an English stage magician who attended a séance given by the famous mediums the Davenport brothers in 1865. The Davenports specialized in cabinet phenomena similar to Clara Morrison's, producing spirit hands, floating instruments, and mysterious sounds while bound with ropes inside a wooden cabinet. Maskelyne immediately recognized that the Davenports were using techniques familiar to any escape artist. He built his own spirit cabinet and performed a demonstration showing exactly how the Davenports' effects could be produced through purely physical means: rope manipulation, concealed accomplices, clever timing, and misdirection. His exposure did not end the Davenports' career, but it did introduce doubt into the minds of many observers. Maskelyne went on to build a career as both an entertainer and a debunker, demonstrating how mediums produce their phenomena and warning the public against fraud. Harry Houdini, the great American escape artist and magician, would later take up this crusade with even greater fervour. Though Houdini's major anti-spiritualist campaign would come in the 1920s, his investigations drew on decades of accumulated knowledge about mediumistic trickery. Houdini was motivated partly by his own grief. He had lost his beloved mother and desperately wanted to contact her, and partly by his professional outrage at seeing audiences deceived by techniques he recognized as standard magic tricks. He attended séances in disguise, caught mediums in fraud, and published exposés that revealed the methods behind seemingly impossible phenomena. The techniques Houdini exposed were often ingeniously simple. Spirit hands could be created using inflated rubber gloves on the end of a stick. Ectoplasm was muslin or cheesecloth. sometimes swallowed and regurgitated for dramatic effect. Spirit voices could be produced by ventriloquism or by speaking tubes that allowed accomplices in other rooms to whisper into the séance chamber. Table tipping was accomplished through leverage and unconscious muscular action. Spirit writing on slates used chemically treated surfaces, fake slate panels, or simple sleight of hand to switch prepared slates for blank ones. Yet even detailed exposés failed to shake the faith of committed believers. The phenomena of spiritualism were subject to what might be called evidentiary asymmetry. For skeptics, a single proven case of fraud cast doubt on all mediumistic phenomena. If this medium cheated, why should we trust any medium? But for believers, a single unexplained phenomenon outweighed dozens of exposures. If even one case is genuine, then survival after death is proven and materialist science is overthrown. The stakes were too high, the implications too profound for a merely empirical approach to settle the matter. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in London in 1882, represented an attempt to bridge this divide. Its members included both believers and skeptics, both scientists and philosophers, united by a commitment to rigorous investigation rather than predetermined conclusions. The Society conducted systematic studies of mediums, documenting successful tests and exposed frauds with equal diligence. They developed protocols designed to eliminate trickery, better lighting, careful searches of mediums and séance rooms, the use of controls and witnesses. Some of their investigations were remarkably thorough. The medium Leonora Piper, an American trance medium who came to the Society's attention in the 1880s, was studied intensively for decades. Investigators hired detectives to follow her, to determine if she was gathering information about potential clients through normal means. They brought her to England, away from her usual environment and sources of information, and tested her with sitters she could not possibly have researched. They recorded her trance statements verbatim and analysed them for accuracy. The results were ambiguous. Leonora Piper produced information that seemed impossible to explain through normal means: names, dates, personal details known only to the deceased and the sitter. She also produced vast quantities of vague, generic statements that could apply to anyone. She had periods of remarkable accuracy and periods of complete failure. Some investigators concluded she was genuine. Others suggested she was an extraordinarily skilled cold reader who occasionally made lucky guesses. The debate continued for decades without resolution. The problem was that investigating mediumship was not like investigating physics or chemistry, where experiments could be precisely controlled and repeated. Every séance was unique. The conditions varied. The medium's performance was inconsistent. What worked one night failed the next. Mediums claimed that skeptical observers disrupted the spiritual energy, making phenomena less likely to occur precisely when rigorous testing was applied. This was a convenient defense against falsification, but it also reflected something true about the psychology of the séance. Belief and expectation were part of the phenomenon, not external to it. Fraud was undoubtedly widespread. The financial incentives were substantial. A successful medium could earn far more than she could in any other profession available to women of her class. The temptation to supplement genuine psychic ability, if any, with trickery must have been considerable. And many mediums probably rationalized their fraud as serving a higher purpose. If their clients received comfort and healing, if the bereaved found solace, did it matter whether the spirits were objectively real or theatrically simulated? But the existence of fraud did not prove that all spiritualist phenomena were fraudulent. Some cases remained genuinely puzzling even to skilled skeptics. Information was sometimes produced that seemed inexplicable through normal means. Phenomena occurred under conditions that appeared to rule out trickery, and the subjective experiences reported by sitters, the sense of presence, the feeling of contact, the emotional impact of the séance, were real regardless of their cause. The faithful continued to attend séances not because they were fools, or because they ignored evidence of fraud, but because the séance provided something they needed. It provided community, a gathering of like-minded individuals who validated each other's experiences and beliefs. It provided ritual, a structured occasion that marked important transitions and honoured the dead. It provided hope, the promise that death was not an ending, that consciousness survived, that reunion was possible. And it provided, for those who believed, direct personal experience of the supernatural, an encounter with mystery that scientific skepticism could not entirely explain away. The relationship between mediums and their clients was complex and cannot be reduced to simple categories of deceiver and deceived. Many mediums believed in their own gifts even when they used trickery. They saw the tricks as helping the spirits manifest when conditions were not ideal. Many clients half suspected deception but chose to believe anyway, because the alternative that the dead were truly gone was unbearable. The séance existed in a space between truth and performance, between grief and healing, between evidence and faith, and it served its purposes in that ambiguous territory. By the 1870s, spiritualism had survived its first wave of exposés and settled into an established position in Victorian culture. It was no longer a radical new movement, but an accepted, if controversial, feature of the spiritual landscape. Mediums operated openly. Spiritualist churches were established, holding services that combined elements of Protestant worship with séance phenomena. Publications dedicated to spiritualism circulated widely. The movement had its celebrities, its scandals, schisms and controversies, just like any other religious tradition. And on Halloween night, when believers and skeptics alike acknowledged that the boundary between worlds grew thin, the séance rooms filled with those who hoped to hear, just once more, the voices of those they had loved and lost. Whether those voices came from the dead or from the deep wells of human longing, they spoke words of comfort into the darkness, and the darkness, for a moment, seemed a little less absolute. Chapter 8. The Eddy Brothers and the Dark Circle. The farmhouse stood in a valley in Vermont, surrounded by hills that turned gold and red in autumn and white in winter. It was a plain wooden structure, built in the last century, weathered by decades of harsh New England seasons. The Eddy family had lived there for generations, farming the rocky soil, keeping to themselves, carrying a reputation for strangeness that stretched back before the Revolution. The neighbours told stories. The Eddys were witches, some said. They had second sight. They could speak to the dead. They had been persecuted for their gifts, driven from place to place until they found this remote valley where they could practice their strange arts without interference. By 1874, when the farmhouse came to wider attention, it was occupied by William and Horatio Eddy, brothers in their 40s, unmarried, taciturn men who spoke little and smiled less. They had been performing as mediums since childhood, travelling with their mother to give demonstrations of spirit communication throughout New England. They had been examined by scientists, denounced by ministers, celebrated by believers, and ridiculed by skeptics. Now they had returned to the family farm and they were holding séances there, not for money, but for investigation, inviting anyone who wished to witness their phenomena to come and stay. The invitation attracted Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, a lawyer and journalist who would later become famous as a founder of the Theosophical Society. Olcott came as an investigator, determined to approach the Eddy phenomena with scientific rigour. He arrived in September of 1874 and remained for 12 weeks, attending séances almost nightly, documenting what he witnessed with meticulous care. What he saw at the Eddy Farmhouse would convince him that the spirits of the dead could manifest physically, could walk and speak and be touched by the living. The séances were held in a large room on the second floor of the farmhouse. The room was bare except for benches arranged in rows facing a cabinet, a simple enclosure made of wooden boards with a curtain across the front. William Eddy would enter the cabinet and sit in the darkness while the audience waited. No other lights were permitted except a single oil lamp turned low, providing just enough illumination to see shapes and movement, but not fine detail. Within minutes of William entering the cabinet, The curtain would twitch and part, a figure would emerge, dressed in white or pale grey, moving with slow gliding steps. The figure would stand before the assembled witnesses, sometimes speaking, sometimes merely allowing itself to be observed. Then it would retreat into the cabinet and another figure would appear, and another, and another. Over the course of an evening, dozens of different spirits would manifest, each distinct in height, build, manner of dress, and appearance. Olcott documented them all. He took notes, made sketches, recorded descriptions. He saw Native American spirits in buckskin and feathers. He saw soldiers in military uniforms from various periods. He saw women in elaborate Victorian dresses, children in simple clothing, old men with beards, young girls with flowing hair. He saw spirits who claimed to be the deceased relatives of people in the audience, who approached specific individuals and spoke to them in low voices, offering names and personal details. The variety was remarkable and troubling. If this were fraud, if William Eddy was simply disguising himself and emerging from the cabinet in costume, how could he produce such diverse appearances? He was a tall, heavy-set man with dark hair and a full beard. Yet some of the spirits who appeared were short and slight. Some were clean-shaven. Some appeared to be female. Some were children no more than 4 feet tall. Some had long white beards. Some wore elaborate costumes that would have required considerable time to put on and remove. Olcott and other investigators searched the cabinet repeatedly. It was a simple wooden enclosure, 7 feet deep and 4 feet wide, with solid board walls on 3 sides and the curtain on the 4th. There was no hidden exit, no trapdoor, no concealed storage space large enough to hold multiple costumes. The floor was solid. The walls were solid. William Eddy entered wearing his ordinary work clothes, coarse trousers, a shirt, boots, and investigators examined him before each séance to ensure he carried nothing concealed. Yet the spirits appeared. Sometimes 2 or 3 would be visible simultaneously, one standing outside the cabin while another could be glimpsed moving inside, and William's own form visible seated in his chair. How could one man occupy 3 positions at once? Olcott tried to catch the spirits, to seize them, and prove they were physical disguises. He was never quite quick enough. The spirits would retreat into the cabinet before he could grasp them firmly. On one occasion, he did manage to touch a spirit's hand. It felt cold, damp, and yielded to pressure as flesh would. But when he tried to hold it, the hand seemed to dissolve, becoming insubstantial and slipping through his fingers. Other phenomena accompanied the materializations. Musical instruments in the cabinet would play by themselves. A guitar, a harmonica, bells. Objects would be thrown from the cabinet into the audience. Voices would speak from different locations in the room, sometimes while William's own breathing could be heard from within the cabinet. The spirits would answer questions, converse with sitters, provide information about their lives and deaths. One of the most frequent spirits to appear was an entity who called herself Honto, claiming to be a Native American woman who had lived in the region centuries before. Honto became a kind of master of ceremonies, introducing other spirits, explaining why certain manifestations were strong or weak, mediating between the spirit world and the audience. She spoke in broken English with what witnesses took to be an authentic Native American accent, though skeptics later suggested this was stereotypical stage Indian dialect rather than genuine linguistic evidence. The question of authenticity troubled even to sympathetic observers. The Native American spirits who appeared at the Eddy Farmhouse and at countless other spiritualist séances seemed to conform to romantic stereotypes rather than historical reality. They were noble savages, wise and spiritual, speaking in monosyllables and aphorisms. They dressed in generalized Indian costume rather than the specific clothing of particular tribes and periods. They seemed to exist primarily to validate white spiritualist beliefs about the superiority of indigenous spiritual wisdom over European rationalism. Critics suggested that spiritualists were projecting their own fantasies onto the spirits, using Native American identities as a convenient exotic other through which to critique their own culture. The spirits themselves had no agency, no actual connection to Native American people or traditions. They were inventions, theatrical characters serving the psychological and ideological needs of predominantly white middle-class audiences. But for believers like Olcott, such concerns were secondary to the immediate experience. He witnessed what he believed were genuine materializations. He saw forms that could not be explained as simple disguises. He touched flesh that seemed solid and then insubstantial. He recorded testimony from dozens of witnesses who claimed to have recognized deceased relatives among the manifesting spirits, and he tried to find a naturalistic explanation and could not. Olcott's account of his time at the Eddy Farmhouse, published as People from the Other World in 1875, brought national attention to the brothers. Visitors came from across America and from Europe, making the journey to the remote Vermont Valley to witness the phenomena for themselves. Most came away convinced. A few remained skeptical, suggesting that Olcott had been deceived, that accomplices were hidden in the farmhouse, that the whole thing was an elaborate hoax. But no one could definitively prove fraud. The Eddy brothers themselves remained enigmatic. They gave no interviews, offered no explanations for their abilities, made no grand claims about their importance to spiritualism. They simply continued to hold their séances, night after night, allowing the spirits to manifest, asking nothing in return except that witnesses approach with respect and openness. They lived simple, isolated lives, farming during the day and sitting in the cabinet at night, serving as channels for whatever force or entities chose to use them. The concept of the dark circle, the term used for séances held in near total darkness, was controversial even within spiritualism. Critics pointed out that darkness made deception far easier, that it was precisely in the dark that mediums could employ tricks that would be obvious in light. Defenders argued that spirits required darkness to manifest, that light disrupted the subtle energies necessary for materialization, that demanding bright illumination was like demanding that a photographer develop film in direct sunlight. The truth was probably that both factors operated simultaneously. Darkness did make trickery easier, but darkness also enhanced the psychological conditions necessary for the belief. In darkness, suggestion became more powerful. Ambiguous stimuli were interpreted as meaningful. The mind filled in details that the eyes could not see. A slight figure glimpsed dimly in motion could be a short person or a tall person stooping. A pale shape could be a face or a piece of cloth. A voice heard from the shadows could be coming from anywhere. The dark circle created conditions in which the normal processes of perception and judgment were suspended. Witnesses were already primed to expect supernatural phenomena. They were in an unfamiliar environment, surrounded by strangers who shared their beliefs, following a medium who commanded authority and trust. The darkness intensified their focus, eliminated distractions, heightened their sensitivity to any stimulus that did occur. In such conditions, ordinary events could seem extraordinary, and ambiguous experiences could be interpreted as proof of the supernatural. Yet the Eddy phenomena pushed beyond what could easily be explained by psychology alone. The sheer number and variety of forms that appeared, the specific details provided, the multiple simultaneous manifestations, the testimony of numerous independent witnesses, all of this suggested that something more than simple trickery was occurring, even if that something was not necessarily spirit materialization as believers understood it. Modern researchers have suggested alternative explanations. Perhaps William Eddy was a remarkably skilled quick change artist who could alter his appearance rapidly using minimal props. Perhaps the farmhouse contained secret passages and hidden accomplices that investigators failed to discover. Perhaps the witnesses, predisposed to believe, unconsciously colluded in creating a shared illusion, filling in gaps and resolving ambiguities in favor of spirit manifestation. Perhaps the phenomena were genuine but misinterpreted, some form of psychic projection or telepathic illusion, rather than actual materialized spirits. The Eddy brothers continued their séances for several more years, but eventually the visitors stopped coming. The phenomena became less dramatic or perhaps less novel. William Eddy died in 1892, and with him died the Materializations. Horatio continued to live in the farmhouse alone and silent until his own death. The building fell into disrepair and was eventually demolished. The site where hundreds of spirits allegedly walked among the living is now an empty field marked by nothing except a historical plaque that mentions the Eddy Farmhouse without explaining what occurred there. But the legacy of the Eddy Circle persisted. The detailed accounts provided by Olcott and other witnesses became part of spiritualist lore, cited as evidence that materialization was possible, that the dead could return in visible, tangible form. The dark séance, despite its obvious vulnerabilities to fraud, remained the preferred method for physical mediumship precisely because it was in darkness that the most dramatic phenomena occurred. And the question of what actually happened in that Vermont farmhouse on those autumn nights in 1874 remains, like so much in spiritualist history, stubbornly unresolved, neither conclusively proven nor definitively debunked, suspended in the same liminal space between skepticism and belief that the séance itself occupied. Chapter 9. The Voice from Beyond, the moment had arrived. The sitters had been in darkness for nearly an hour, their hands linked in the unbroken circle, their breathing synchronized into a collective rhythm that seemed to pulse through the room like a heartbeat. The medium sat at the head of the table, her head thrown back, her eyes closed beneath their lids, her face slack and pale as wax in the faint glow of the single candle that burned on the mantelpiece. She had been silent for long minutes, her chest rising and falling slowly, deeply, as if she slept though she sat upright. The silence had weight. It pressed against the ears and the skin. It made ordinary sounds, the creak of a chair, the rustle of fabric, the distant tolling of a church bell seem impossibly loud and near. And then she gasped. A sharp intake of breath, sudden and violent, as if she had been underwater and had just broken the surface. Her body went rigid. Her hands, which had been loose in the grip of her neighbour's, clenched tight. Her head snapped forward, her chin dropping to her chest. A tremor ran through her, visible even in the dimness, a shudder that began at her shoulders and travelled down her spine. The sitters held their breath. This was the transition. This was the moment when the medium surrendered her consciousness and something else moved in. When she spoke, the voice was not her own. It was deeper, rougher, with an accent that had not been present before. It was the voice of her spirit guide, the entity who served as intermediary between the medium and the other spirits who wished to communicate. The guide had a name, Samuel or Red Cloud or John King, depending on the medium and her tradition. The guide spoke slowly, as if the act of using vocal cords and shaping words required tremendous effort. "I am here," the voice said. "The way is open. They gather, so many, pressing close, eager to speak. I will bring them through one by one as strength permits. But you must remain calm. You must keep faith. You must hold the circle. If the circle breaks, I cannot protect you from what waits in the darkness. Do you understand?" The sitters murmured their agreement. They understood. They had been warned at the beginning of the séance. The circle was sacred. The linked hands created a container of energy that allowed the spirits to manifest safely. To break the circle was to invite chaos, to risk possession or madness or worse. No matter what they witnessed, no matter how frightened or excited they became, they must not let go. The medium's body relaxed slightly. The spirit guide was settling in, growing comfortable in the borrowed flesh. "There is one who comes forward," the voice continued. "A woman, young. She passed not long ago. She wore white when she left your world. There is sorrow around her, deep sorrow. She wishes to speak to Margaret. Is Margaret here?" A woman across the table drew a sharp breath. "I am Margaret," she said, her voice trembling. Is it Catherine? My sister Catherine?" She says yes. She shows me flowers, white flowers, many white flowers. She says you chose them. She says they were beautiful. She thanks you for them. Margaret was weeping now, silently, tears streaming down her face. The flowers had been her choice. White roses and lilies for Catherine's funeral only 3 months ago. Catherine had died of consumption at 23. had wasted away over months of suffering until death came as a mercy. Margaret had nursed her through it all, had been there at the end, had closed her sister's eyes and arranged her body for burial. And she had chosen the flowers, had filled the room with white blossoms because Catherine had loved gardens, had spent what little strength she had in her final weeks asking about the roses, whether they had bloomed, whether they were beautiful this year. "Tell her," Margaret whispered. "Please, tell her that I miss her, that I think of her every day, that I wish I could have saved her." The medium's head tilted, as if listening to a voice the others could not hear. "She says you did save her. Your love saved her. Your care made her last days bearable. She says she was not afraid at the end because you were there. She says she felt your hand holding hers as she crossed over. She felt your love following her into the light. She says you must not grieve so much. She is well now. She is free of pain. She is in a place of such beauty, such peace. She walks in gardens there, Margaret. Endless gardens where the flowers never fade. She is happy. She wants you to be happy too." Margaret was sobbing now, her whole body shaking with the force of it. The women on either side of her held her hands tightly, keeping the circle intact. "Tell her I love her," Margaret managed to say. "Tell her I will always love her." "She knows," the spirit guide said gently. "She has always known. Love does not end, Margaret. It cannot end. It is the only thing that survives death unchanged. She loves you still, she will love you always, and when your time comes, she will be there waiting. You will walk in those gardens together." The medium's body shuddered again. The spirit guide spoke once more, the voice growing fainter. "She fades now. The strength required to hold her here is too great. But she will return. She is always near you, Margaret. In the morning light, in the scent of roses, in the quiet moments before sleep, she is there. Remember that. Be comforted." Margaret nodded, unable to speak. The women beside her squeezed her hands in sympathy, and the séance continued. The spirit guide announced another presence, an older man seeking his son. A middle-aged gentleman near the end of the table recognized the description. His father, dead 5 years. A shipping merchant who had built a fortune through hard work and careful investment. The spirit gave advice about a business decision the son was contemplating. The advice was sound, practical, the kind of thing his father would have said in life. The son accepted it gratefully, promised to follow it. Another spirit came, and another. A child who had drowned, speaking to his mother in a high, sweet voice, assuring her that he played with other children in the spirit world, that he was not lonely, not afraid. A young man killed in war, telling his widow that his death had been quick, that he had not suffered long, that she should not feel guilty for remarrying, that he wanted her to find happiness again. An elderly woman who had died in her sleep speaking to her daughter about a hidden document, a will that had been mislaid, providing specific instructions about where to search for it. The messages continued for more than an hour. Some were evidential, providing specific details that seemed impossible for the medium to know through normal means. Others were generic, vague enough to apply to almost anyone, yet specific enough in delivery that believers found them convincing. And all of them offered comfort. That was the consistent theme, the underlying message of every spirit communication. The dead were not suffering, they were not lost, they were happy. They loved those they had left behind. They would be reunited in time. Death was not an ending, but a transition, a doorway into a realm more real and more beautiful than the physical world. As the séance progressed, the phenomena intensified. The table began to move, rocking gently at first and then more violently, tilting up onto its 2 legs despite the hands pressed to its surface. The trumpet in the center of the circle began to glow more brightly, its phosphorescent coating seeming to pulse with energy. Then it rose, floating upward into the air, drifting across the table. A voice came through it, a whisper amplified by the metal cone speaking a name, calling to someone in the circle. The trumpet moved to that person, hovering before their face, and the voice spoke directly to them. Words meant for them alone. In the darkness beyond the table, shapes began to move. Pale forms, indistinct and flickering like candlelight reflected in water. Some sitters claimed to see faces in those forms, to recognize features. Others saw only abstract luminosity, light where there should be none. The medium moaned softly, her body trembling with the effort of maintaining the connection between worlds. The spirit guide spoke again, warning that the energy was nearly exhausted, that the séance must soon end, but that those who had not yet received messages should not despair. The spirits would return, would find other opportunities to communicate. And then came the moment that would be remembered and debated by everyone present. The moment that seemed to transcend the theatrical framework of the séance and touch something genuinely uncanny. The medium's body went rigid again, but this time differently. Her face contorted, twisted into an expression of anguish. Her hands, still held by her neighbours, went cold as ice. Her breathing stopped entirely. For long seconds she did not breathe at all, and the sitters began to fear that something had gone wrong, that the spirits had claimed her, that she would not return. Then her mouth opened, wide, too wide. Her jaw seemed to unhinge like a snake's, and from her mouth came a pale, glowing substance, flowing out like liquid but hanging in the air like mist. Ectoplasm. The material substance of spirit. It emerged slowly, pooling in the air before her face, taking vague shapes. A hand, a face, forms that shifted and changed too quickly to be clearly seen. The sitters stared, transfixed and horrified. Some wanted to look away but could not. Others wanted to reach out and touch it, but dared not break the circle. The ectoplasm glowed brighter, and within it faces appeared, or seemed to appear. Later, when they compared notes, the sitters would disagree about what they had seen. Some claimed to see clearly defined faces of the dead, recognizing features. Others saw only vague approximations, shadows and light that suggested faces without actually forming them. A few saw nothing but the glowing substance itself, beautiful and terrible. Proof that something beyond the physical existed, that matter could be transmuted, that the veil between worlds was not metaphorical but actual, and that it could be pierced. The ectoplasm hung in the air for perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps a minute. Time seemed uncertain, elastic, stretched by the intensity of the experience. Then it began to recede, flowing back into the medium's mouth, drawn back into her body as if by some invisible tide. Her jaw closed, her breathing resumed, ragged and harsh. Her face regained its normal colour. The spirit guide spoke one last time, the voice weak and distant. "We must go now. The door must close, but remember what you have witnessed. Remember that death is an illusion. Remember that love endures. Remember that we are all eternal, all connected, all part of a greater whole that transcends the limitations of flesh. We will return. We are never far until we meet again. Farewell." The medium slumped forward, her head dropping to the table. For a moment the sitters feared she was dead, that the effort had been too much. Then she stirred, groaning softly, raising her head slowly. Her eyes opened. They were her own eyes again, not the eyes of the spirit guide. She looked around the circle, confused and exhausted. "What happened?" she asked, her voice weak. "Did they come? Did anyone receive messages?" The sitters assured her that yes, many spirits had come. Many messages had been delivered. She smiled faintly, satisfied, though she claimed to remember nothing of the trance, nothing of what had been said. Someone helped her to her feet. She swayed, steadied herself, allowed herself to be led to a chair away from the table. The gas lamps were lit slowly, gradually, so as not to shock eyes that had been in darkness for so long. The sitters blinked in the sudden brightness, looking at each other with dazed expressions, as if waking from a shared dream. They were exhausted, emotionally wrung out, but also exhilarated. They had witnessed something extraordinary. They had heard the voices of the dead. They had seen manifestations that defied rational explanation. Whether those phenomena were genuinely supernatural or the product of suggestion and theatrical skill was, in that moment, beside the point. They had experienced something profound. They had been given hope. They had been assured that death was not the end. Margaret, the woman who had received the message from her sister, approached the medium and pressed money into her hand, far more than the séance fee. "Thank you," she whispered. "You've given me back my sister. You've given me peace." The medium accepted the money with a tired smile, murmuring that she was merely a vessel, that the thanks belonged to the spirits, not to her. One by one the sitters departed into the October night. It was late now, past midnight, and the streets were empty and cold. Halloween was ending, slipping into the 1st of November, into All Saints' Day. The veil, which had been so thin, was closing again. The spirits were withdrawing. The ordinary world was reasserting itself. But for those who had sat in that darkened room, who had heard the voice from beyond, something had changed. They would never think about death in quite the same way. They would carry with them always the memory of this night when the impossible had seemed possible, when the dead had spoken, when the darkness had been illuminated not by candle or gas lamp, but by the faint, inexplicable glow of something that might have been spirit, might have been hope, might have been love, refusing to acknowledge the finality of the grave. Chapter 10. The candle burns low. The séance rooms grew emptier as the century drew toward its close. The darkened parlors that had once filled with believers every Halloween, where mediums channeled the dead and tables rapped out messages from beyond, began to fall silent. The great wave of spiritualism that had swept through Britain and America in the middle decades of the 19th century was receding, not vanishing entirely but withdrawing into smaller circles, quieter gatherings, less public spaces. The movement that had once seemed poised to transform religious understanding and scientific knowledge became instead a curious remnant, a survival from an earlier era, maintained by the devoted but increasingly ignored by the wider culture. Multiple forces converged to diminish spiritualism's hold on the Victorian imagination. The accumulation of exposés had taken their toll. Too many frauds had been caught, too many tricks revealed, too many mediums exposed as cynical performers rather than genuine channels. The theatrical methods that had once seemed mysterious became familiar through repetition and explanation. Stage magicians demonstrated how to produce raps, move tables, create the illusion of floating objects and spirit hands. The mystery dissolved into technique, and with the mystery went much of the power. The rise of psychology offered alternative explanations for spiritualist phenomena that did not require supernatural intervention. Researchers began to understand dissociation, suggestion, unconscious perception, and group dynamics. What had been attributed to spirits could now be explained as psychological processes: hallucination, autosuggestion, cryptomnesia, the power of expectation to shape perception. The medium in trance was not possessed by an external entity, but experiencing a dissociative state, accessing her own subconscious mind and presenting its contents as if they came from outside. The séance worked not because spirits were present, but because human beings were remarkably skilled at creating shared experiences through subtle social cues and mutual suggestion. The decline of Victorian death culture also contributed to spiritualism's fading. As the 20th century approached, attitudes toward death and mourning began to shift. The elaborate rituals of Victorian grief, the years of mourning dress, the cult of the cemetery, the sentimental focus on death and loss came to seem morbid and excessive. A new emphasis on vitality, progress, and forward-looking optimism replaced the Victorian preoccupation with memory in the past. To dwell on the dead was increasingly seen as unhealthy. The proper response to loss was not prolonged grief, but recovery, adjustment, getting on with life. Medical advances reduced mortality rates, particularly among children. As fewer families experienced the death of a child, the desperate need for contact with the deceased diminished. The terrible infant mortality of the mid-19th century, which had driven so many bereaved mothers to the séance room, began to decline as sanitation improved, as germ theory was accepted, as basic public health measures were implemented. Fewer dead children meant fewer grieving parents seeking supernatural reassurance that their children's souls survived. The carnage of the First World War, beginning in 1914, would briefly revive spiritualism as millions of families sought contact with sons and husbands killed in the trenches. But this revival was different in character from the earlier movement. It was more desperate, more bitter, less willing to accept generic messages of happiness and peace. The spirits of young men killed in mud and poison gas did not easily conform to the Victorian vision of the afterlife as a realm of gardens and light. The séances held during and after the Great War often produced messages of confusion, anger, and suffering rather than reassurance, and this troubled believers and skeptics alike. But even before that terrible renewal, spiritualism had been declining for decades. The organizations and institutions that supported the movement fragmented and weakened. Spiritualist churches closed or merged, publications ceased. The networks of mediums and investigators that had once connected cities throughout the English-speaking world dissolved. Some practitioners abandoned mediumship entirely, moving into other occult traditions, theosophy, ceremonial magic, new thought. Others retired, grew old, died, and were not replaced by a new generation. The mediums who remained active in the late Victorian and Edwardian period were often shadows of their predecessors. The phenomena they produced were less dramatic, less convincing. Perhaps the techniques had become too familiar. Perhaps the cultural moment that had made spiritualism seem plausible had passed. Or perhaps, if one believed in the spirits themselves had withdrawn, finding that the séance room no longer served their purposes, that the messages they wished to deliver could not be heard by an increasingly skeptical age. Yet spiritualism did not entirely disappear. It persisted, changed, adapted. In the 20th century, it would continue in several forms. Spiritualist churches maintained their congregations, smaller than before but devoted, holding services that combined Protestant hymns and prayers with demonstrations of mediumship. Mediums continued to practice, usually in private rather than in public halls, reading for individual clients rather than performing before audiences. The séance itself became rarer, replaced by individual sittings where the medium worked one-on-one with the bereaved. The Halloween séance, that special observance when the veil between worlds was said to be thinnest, became primarily a performance, an entertainment, a nod to tradition rather than a serious spiritual practice. Halloween itself transformed, becoming increasingly secular, commercial, focused on children's costumes and candy rather than on communion with the dead. The ancient roots of the holiday, Samhain, the Celtic festival of the dead, the time when spirits walked among the living, were obscured by the modern customs that turned death into decoration, transformed fear into fun, made the supernatural safely imaginary. But the need that spiritualism had addressed, the human longing for connection with the dead, for proof that consciousness survived the body's death, for reassurance that love was stronger than the grave, that need did not disappear. It found other outlets. Bereaved parents joined support groups rather than attending séances. People sought a comfort in religious faith that did not require proof, in memories rather than manifestations, in psychology rather than spirits. The dead were honoured through charity and memorial rather than summoned through mediums. Still, in certain quarters, the practice continued. There were always those who believed, who had experienced something in a séance that they could not explain away, who had heard a voice or received a message that seemed too specific, too accurate to be coincidence or cold reading. They gathered quietly in private homes, maintaining the tradition, holding the circle, listening in the darkness for the knock that signalled the presence of the beloved dead. In small spiritualist churches, on Halloween night, the old rituals were sometimes performed. The room would be darkened, candles would be lit, hands would be linked. A medium would enter trance and spirits would allegedly speak. The messages would be similar to those delivered 100 years earlier, reassurances of survival, expressions of love, reminders that death was not an ending. Whether the spirits were real or imagined, whether the medium was genuine or performing, the function remained the same. The séance provided comfort, community, and hope to those who needed it. The historians who would later study spiritualism struggled to assess its significance. Was it a genuine spiritual movement that revealed truths about the nature of consciousness and survival? Or was it a mass delusion, a psychological phenomenon driven by grief and wishful thinking? Was it evidence of human gullibility and the ease with which populations could be deceived by clever frauds? Or was it a creative response to the spiritual crisis of modernity, an attempt to reconcile science and faith to find meaning in an increasingly mechanistic universe? Perhaps it was all of these things. Spiritualism was complex, contradictory, impossible to reduce to a single judgment. It was both genuine spiritual seeking and theatrical performance, both consolation and exploitation, both fraud and faith. It served purposes beyond its explicit claims about spirits and survival. It gave women authority and income in an era when both were scarce. It created communities of belief that supported their members through loss and isolation. It challenged religious orthodoxy and opened space for religious innovation. It insisted that the boundary between science and religion was permeable, that investigation and faith could coexist. And it left a legacy that persisted long after the séance rooms had closed. The idea that the dead could communicate, that consciousness survived bodily death, that love transcended the grave, these ideas remained powerful even for those who rejected spiritualist methods. The vocabulary and imagery of spiritualism entered popular culture and stayed there. Ghosts in Victorian literature, and later in film and television, often behaved like spiritualist spirits, delivering messages, seeking resolution, appearing to the living in dreams or visions or through mediums. The techniques developed by mediums, cold reading, mentalism, the use of suggestion and performance to create powerful psychological effects, were adapted by stage performers, therapists, and even fraudulent psychics who continued to prey on the bereaved. The ethical questions raised by spiritualism, whether it was wrong to provide false hope, whether comfort based on deception was better than no comfort at all, whether the ends justified the means, remained relevant in contexts far removed from the séance room. As the 20th century progressed and then gave way to the 21st, new forms of contact with the dead emerged. Electronic voice phenomena, where the dead allegedly spoke through radiostatic or telephone interference. Instrumental transcommunication, where spirits supposedly manipulated electronic devices to send messages. Mediums who claimed to channel spirits on television, performing for mass audiences what had once been intimate gatherings in darkened parlors. The methods changed, but the human need remained constant. And on Halloween night, even in a secular age, something of the old beliefs persisted. Children dressed as ghosts and goblins, not knowing they were participating in traditions thousands of years old. Adults told ghost stories, seeking the pleasant thrill of fear, the frisson of imagining that the boundary between living and dead might be less secure than reason suggested. Some people, fewer now but still some, gathered in circles and attempted to summon spirits, maintaining practices their great-grandparents would have recognized. The candle burned low, the wax pooled and hardened, the flame guttered and grew small, but it did not quite go out. The séance, that curious Victorian institution, that meeting place of grief and hope and theatricality and possibly something more, had left its mark on the culture that created it, and in the dark corners of October nights, when the veil between worlds was said to grow thin, when memory and longing made the impossible seem momentarily plausible, the spirits of spiritualism's golden age still whispered in the shadows, still offered their messages of comfort and survival, still insisted against all evidence that death was not the end, that love endured, that the dead were not lost but only waiting, only sleeping, only one knock away in the darkness. The Victorian séance was both ending and beginning, both conclusion and threshold. It marked the close of one way of thinking about death and the opening of another. It was the last gasp of a pre-modern worldview that saw spirits everywhere and the first stirring of a modern psychology that would internalize those spirits, transform them from external entities into projections of the unconscious mind. It was the death rattle of certainty and the birth cry of ambiguity, a moment when the line between truth and illusion blurred so completely that neither believers nor skeptics could claim absolute victory. And perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps the séance, like the moment it celebrated, like Halloween itself, like the thinning of the veil between worlds, was meant to be liminal, uncertain, suspended between categories. Perhaps its power came precisely from its ambiguity, from the way it refused to be definitively proven or disproven, from its insistence that some questions could not be answered, but only experienced, lived with, held in the darkness like a candle flame cupped in trembling hands. The room was silent now. The last sitters had departed. The medium had removed her veil and counted her earnings and climbed the stairs to her bedroom. The candles had been extinguished. The gas lamps had been turned off. Halloween was over, slipping into the grey dawn of All Saints' Day. The dead, if they had been present, had withdrawn. The spirits, if they existed, had returned to their own realm. The veil had closed. But in that darkened room, in the residue of emotion and hope and fear that lingered after the living had gone, something remained. Not proof, not evidence, but possibility. The possibility that consciousness survived. The possibility that love was stronger than death. The possibility that in the darkness, when the ordinary defences of reason and skepticism were set aside, when the human heart was open and vulnerable and desperate, something might reach across the abyss and touch, just for a moment, just long enough to whisper a name, to offer comfort, to remind the living that they were not alone. The candle burned low, and then, finally, inevitably, it went out. The darkness was complete. But in that darkness, someone somewhere was already lighting another candle, already sitting down at another table, already joining hands with others who believed or who wanted to believe, already waiting for the knock that would signal the presence of the beloved dead. The séance was ending, but it would never entirely end. As long as people grieved, as long as people loved, as long as people feared death and yearned for proof that something survived, the circle would form again. The hands would link, the darkness would gather, and the whisper would come, faint but unmistakable, carrying across the years and across the veil, "I am here. I am still here. I have never left you."